Among the many professions that thrived in the fractured kingdoms of the continent, few carried the weight of moral ambiguity that accompanied the title of bounty hunter. These men existed at the margins of legitimate society, neither sworn soldiers bound by oath nor guild assassins answerable to organizational codes, occupying instead a liminal space where coin mattered more than allegiance and reputation served as the sole currency of trust. The profession drew those capable of enduring solitude, hardship, and the corrosive effects of violence enacted for payment rather than principle. Within the social hierarchy of the northern kingdoms and the sprawling dominion of Nilfgaard, bounty hunters held no formal rank, received no honors, yet commanded a peculiar respect born from necessity and fear. Lords hired them when discretion mattered more than honor, merchants employed them to recover debts when legal recourse proved insufficient, and military commanders occasionally retained their services when targets lay beyond the reach of conventional forces. Before we step into the grim shadow that stalked the continent's history, the name of Leo Bonhart, I'd be honored if you would like this video and consider subscribing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. The distinction between bounty hunter, mercenary, and assassin appeared subtle to those unfamiliar with the profession's internal gradations, though practitioners recognized the boundaries clearly. Mercenaries sold their swords to causes, fighting in units under command structures that imposed discipline and collective purpose. Assassins specialized in eliminating specific individuals through stealth, poison, or subterfuge, their craft demanding precision over endurance. Bounty hunters, by contrast, pursued quarry across vast distances, through hostile terrain and dangerous territories, relying on tracking skills, combat prowess, and the psychological advantage conferred by their reputation. That reputation formed the true foundation of a hunter's career, spreading through tavern gossip, merchant warnings, and the fearful whispers of those who had witnessed their work. A name associated with successful captures, brutal efficiency, and an unwillingness to abandon a trail became more valuable than any weapon, opening doors to higher-paying contracts and ensuring that targets understood the futility of resistance before the first confrontation occurred. Into this profession, sometime during the years when war repeatedly washed across the continent's northern territories, emerged a name that gradually accumulated layers of dread with each retelling: Leo Bonhart. The earliest mentions appeared in the conversations of professional soldiers returning from campaigns, men accustomed to violence yet disturbed by encounters with this particular hunter. Later, merchants traveling the trade routes between kingdoms learned to recognize the name as a warning, a signal to avoid certain regions when word spread of his presence. Eventually, even the courts of minor nobles and the councils of free cities acknowledged his existence, though always obliquely, never inviting direct association. What distinguished Bonhart from the multitude of bounty hunters operating across the realms lay not in his methods alone, which resembled those employed by many in his profession, nor solely in his success rate, though his reputation for completing contracts proved exceptional. Rather, the difference manifested in the aura of wrongness that surrounded him, a quality that transcended mere ruthlessness and entered territory most associated with creatures dwelling in dark forests and abandoned crypts. Those who survived encounters with him described a figure standing nearly 7 feet in height, a skeletal frame that appeared simultaneously fragile and terrifying, as though death itself had assumed human form to walk among the living. His face bore the gauntness of advanced age, skin stretched tight across prominent bones, creating an appearance more cadaverous than vital. The eyes, however, inspired the most consistent descriptions across varied accounts: pale, flat, and emotionless as those of a fish preserved too long in a market stall, registering observation without empathy, assessment without humanity. When he entered a room, conversations faltered, not from his words or actions immediately, though those would follow, yet from an instinctive recognition that something fundamentally wrong had crossed the threshold. His presence carried the ghoulish quality of a corpse animated by purposes beyond mortal comprehension, a walking contradiction of elderly frailty concealing capabilities that defied natural law. This was Leo Bonhart as he moved through the war-torn landscape of the northern kingdoms, a shadow before a name, a reputation that preceded the man, and a terror that outlasted both. The decades following the Second Nilfgaardian War's conclusion left the northern kingdoms scarred by more than battlefield losses and territorial concessions. Entire provinces had witnessed their administrative structures collapse under the weight of sustained military occupation, retreating armies, and the chaotic aftermath of treaties that pleased no faction entirely. Local justice systems, already weakened by corruption and resource depletion, found themselves overwhelmed by the flood of displaced persons, discharged soldiers turning to banditry, and merchants whose ruined fortunes drove them toward criminal enterprise. In this landscape of fragmented authority and endemic violence, traditional law enforcement proved inadequate to the scale of disorder. Town guards maintained control within walls when they received regular payment, which grew increasingly irregular as tax revenues declined. Rural areas fell under the protection of whatever local lord retained sufficient armed retainers to patrol his diminished holdings, leaving vast stretches of countryside effectively lawless. The roads connecting major settlements became hunting grounds for organized bandit companies, some composed of former military units that simply refused disbandment, others assembled from the desperate and the predatory drawn together by opportunity and necessity. Into these gaps stepped those willing to pursue, capture, or eliminate problems that official authorities lacked the capacity or political will to address, creating an economy of violence for hire that flourished precisely because conventional institutions had failed. The demand for skilled trackers and enforcers capable of operating independently across multiple jurisdictions created opportunities for those possessing the requisite combination of martial skill, tracking expertise, and moral flexibility. Payment structures varied considerably depending on the contract's nature and the patron's resources. Wealthy merchants seeking to recover stolen goods or apprehend debtors might offer fixed sums upon delivery of the target, often with bonuses for speed or the target's relatively undamaged condition. Military commanders occasionally retained bounty hunters to locate deserters or eliminate enemy scouts, paying per confirmed completion with proof required, usually in the form of some identifying item or body part. Nobles engaged in covert feuds with rivals employed hunters to remove problematic individuals who could not be challenged openly without political consequences, these contracts typically commanding higher fees due to the discretion required and the potential repercussions if the patron's involvement became known. The most lucrative assignments came from entities possessing both significant resources and urgent need: imperial agents seeking political fugitives, sorcerers pursuing rogue apprentices who had stolen dangerous knowledge, or merchant guilds determined to make examples of thieves who had damaged their collective interests. Payment might arrive in gold, land grants, trade concessions, or political favors, depending on the patron's nature and the service rendered. Among professional killers, certain unwritten codes had evolved over generations, loose frameworks that provided minimal predictability in an inherently chaotic profession. Most bounty hunters honored contracts once accepted, recognizing that reputation for reliability proved essential to securing future employment. Many refused assignments targeting children or demonstrated willingness to negotiate surrenders that avoided unnecessary combat, understanding that living captives sometimes proved more valuable than corpses and that mercy occasionally generated intelligence about future opportunities. Some specialized in particular types of quarry, developing expertise that commanded premium rates. Hunters who focused on tracking mags learned to recognize signs of spellcasting and invested in protective amulets. Those pursuing monster bounties studied bestiary lore and carried appropriate oils and traps. Even in this profession's moral twilight, gradations existed, distinctions that separated mere ruthlessness from pathological cruelty, efficiency from sadism. Leo Bonhart recognized none of these informal boundaries. Where other hunters might accept a target's surrender and negotiate terms, he continued until incapacitation or death occurred. Where professional standards suggested avoiding collateral casualties to maintain marketability for future contracts, he demonstrated complete indifference to witnesses, bystanders, or anyone unfortunate enough to occupy his proximity during operations. His relationships with patrons followed transactional patterns devoid of loyalty or even consistent allegiance, accepting contracts from multiple parties pursuing contradictory goals, honoring only those terms that suited his immediate interests or curiosities. The psychological profile suggested by his documented actions revealed something qualitatively different from the calculated brutality common among career bounty hunters. Most who survived in this profession developed emotional insulation against violence, treating their work as craft requiring technical competence rather than emotional investment. They became numb to suffering through repeated exposure, achieving detachment that allowed function without descent into madness or moral paralysis. Bonhart demonstrated no such detachment. Witnesses described his careful attention during moments when others would avert their gaze, his focused observation of pain and fear, the almost scholarly interest he exhibited toward suffering's gradations and variations. This suggested active engagement with cruelty rather than professional dissociation, a deliberate cultivation of scenarios that maximized psychological and physical torment. In any era or society, such tendencies would mark an individual as dangerous and aberrant. On the continent during these particular years, when violence had become so normalized that merchants discussed massacres over breakfast and children played games mimicking battlefield tactics, Bonhart's particular brand of sadism still managed to inspire revulsion among those habituated to carnage. Those who encountered Leo Bonhart during his years of operation noted one detail with particular consistency, a feature that transcended even his disturbing physical presence and contributed significantly to his fearsome reputation. Around his neck, suspended on leather cords worn smooth by years of contact with skin and clothing, hung 3 Witcher medallions. Each bore the distinctive shape and symbolic representation of its respective school. The wolf's head with ears swept back and mouth slightly agape, the cat rendered in profile with predatory grace, and the griffin displaying its dual nature as beast of earth and sky. To most inhabitants of the continent, Witcher medallions represented objects of considerable significance, tokens whose meaning extended far beyond mere decoration or identification. These amulets served practical functions for their intended bearers, vibrating in proximity to magical energies and providing warning of supernatural threats that normal human senses might miss entirely. They also functioned as credentials, identifying their wearers as graduates of rigorous training programs, survivors of mutations that transformed human children into professional monster hunters, members of ancient institutions that predated most existing kingdoms and maintained traditions stretching back centuries into the continent's half-remembered history. The schools these medallions represented carried their own distinct reputations and associations among those knowledgeable about Witcher traditions. The School of the Wolf, based in the mountain fortress of Caer Morhen, maintained the closest adherence to what scholars considered classical Witcher philosophy, accepting contracts without political consideration, following a code that emphasized professional conduct, training students in combat techniques that prioritized efficiency and adaptability. The School of the Cat developed a reputation more troubled and ambiguous, associated with witches willing to accept assassination contracts targeting humans rather than restricting their services to monster elimination, producing graduates whose mutation processes sometimes resulted in psychological instability or sociopathic tendencies. The School of the Griffin emphasized signs and magical theory alongside martial training, producing witches more inclined toward scholarly pursuits and diplomatic solutions, though no less capable in combat when circumstances demanded violence. For Bonhart to possess even one such medallion would invite questions and speculation. To wear 3 simultaneously, displayed prominently across his chest like military decorations or hunting trophies, constituted a claim so audacious that it demanded explanation while simultaneously warning observers against requesting one. The explanation Bonhart offered, when he bothered providing any account at all, centered on a simple assertion: he had taken these medallions from 3 witches he had defeated in personal combat. The claim's implications proved staggering to anyone familiar with Witcher capabilities. These were individuals whose physical abilities exceeded normal human parameters through alchemical mutation, whose reflexes operated at speeds that made them appear supernatural, whose training began in childhood and continued with intensity that broke most candidates before they completed even the initial phases. They routinely fought creatures capable of tearing armored knights apart, emerged victorious from confrontations with monsters that had depopulated entire villages, and survived encounters that would represent certain death for ordinary warriors. The suggestion that an unmutated human, regardless of skill level, could defeat not one such opponent through chance or favorable circumstances, though even that would represent an extraordinary achievement, yet 3 separate witches in individual combat scenarios strained credibility past the breaking point for many who heard the claim. Yennefer of Vengerberg, upon encountering Bonhart and observing the medallions, expressed the skepticism that many felt though few dared voice in his presence. Her experience with witches, particularly her long association with Geralt of Rivia, provided intimate knowledge of their combat capabilities and the difficulty inherent in defeating one through conventional means. She questioned whether the medallions truly represented victories in fair duels, the honorable single combat Bonhart's display seemed to suggest, or whether treachery, ambush, poison, or other dishonorable methods had secured these trophies. Perhaps he had acquired them from corpses already dead from other causes, purchased them from grave robbers or thieves who had stolen from fallen witches, or taken them from injured witches incapable of proper defense. The ambiguity surrounding these possibilities remained unresolved in canonical sources, with Bonhart offering no detailed accounts of the supposed confrontations and no independent witnesses coming forward to verify his claims. What remained beyond dispute was his possession of the medallions themselves, physical objects whose authenticity could be verified by those with appropriate knowledge, and the fact that 3 witches bearing these particular tokens had indeed died or disappeared under circumstances that left their medallions available for acquisition. For Bonhart, the medallions served multiple functions that extended beyond simple trophy collection, though that motivation certainly factored into his decision to display them so prominently. They provided proof of his claimed achievements, physical evidence that gave substance to reputation and made his legend tangible to those who might otherwise dismiss the stories as exaggeration. They offered psychological leverage in confrontations, introducing doubt and fear into opponents who recognized what the medallions represented and understood the implications of facing someone who allegedly possessed the skill to defeat witches. The effect proved particularly potent when encountering individuals with connections to witcher schools or training, people capable of fully appreciating the claim's magnitude and the threat it represented. The medallions also functioned as declarations of supremacy over an entire category of warriors, statements that positioned Bonhart above even these legendary fighters in the hierarchy of martial prowess. Whether the claim held truth mattered less than the fact that no one who observed those 3 medallions resting against his skeletal chest felt confident enough to challenge the assertion directly. In this way, the medallions transcended their origins and became weapons themselves, instruments of psychological warfare that Bonhart wielded as skillfully as the blade he carried, creating fear that served his purposes and enhanced his already formidable reputation across every territory where his name had penetrated. The medallions hanging from Bonhart's neck invited questions that extended beyond their acquisition circumstances into more fundamental territory concerning the nature of martial excellence and the limits of human capability. Regardless of how he obtained these tokens, whether through legitimate combat or more dubious means, his documented combat performances throughout his career demonstrated abilities that defied conventional understanding of what unmutated humans could achieve. Witnesses to his confrontations described a swordsman whose technique approached the supernatural, whose movements displayed precision and economy that suggested decades of intensive training refined to eliminate every wasted motion, every inefficient angle, every moment of hesitation that might create vulnerability. His blade work flowed with mechanical perfection, each strike following optimal paths toward vital targets, each defensive maneuver positioning him advantageously for immediate counterattack. The entire performance executed with a detached efficiency of a craftsman demonstrating mastered techniques rather than a warrior fighting for survival. The specific capabilities attributed to Bonhart in reliable accounts bordered on the impossible for ordinary humans operating without magical enhancement or mutation-derived advantages. Multiple witnesses reported observing him dodge crossbow bolts at close range, his body moving with prescient awareness that suggested either supernatural reflexes or uncanny ability to read trajectories and adjust position with minimal motion, turning aside from projectile paths that would leave normal combatants skewered. In engagements against multiple opponents simultaneously, circumstances that typically overwhelm even skilled fighters through sheer numerical advantage and the cognitive burden of tracking multiple threats, he demonstrated capacity to manage tactical complexity that should have exceeded human processing capabilities. He maintained awareness of each opponent's position, weapon state, and probable next action while executing offensive sequences against primary targets and defensive responses against secondary threats, the entire coordination occurring at speeds that left observers struggling to follow the engagement's progression. His endurance during extended combat appeared equally remarkable, sustaining high-intensity effort without the deterioration in performance that fatigue normally imposes, continuing to execute complex techniques with undiminished precision even after durations that would leave conventional warriors gasping and vulnerable. Perhaps most disturbing to those who witnessed his combat prowess was the contrast between his physical appearance and his demonstrated capabilities. Age had clearly marked him, his skeletal frame and gaunt features suggesting someone in his 7th decade at minimum, possibly older, an age when most warriors had long since retired from active combat or suffered significant degradation in speed, strength, and recovery capacity. The natural processes of physical decline spared no one, reducing muscle mass, stiffening joints, slowing neural response times, diminishing the explosive power and sustained endurance that characterized fighters in their prime. Bonhart appeared to operate in defiance of these universal constraints, his elderly body housing abilities that should have resided only in warriors decades younger. This disconnect between appearance and performance created additional psychological impact during confrontations, as opponents misjudged his capabilities based on visual assessment and discovered their error when his blade opened wounds before they could properly react to threats they had underestimated. Analysis of his fighting style, based on descriptions from those who survived encounters or observed from safe distances, revealed methodical precision that resembled Witcher combat techniques in certain fundamental aspects. Witchers learned to approach combat as problem-solving exercises rather than emotional contests, analyzing opponents for patterns and vulnerabilities, selecting techniques optimized for specific enemy types, maintaining emotional detachment that prevented fear or anger from compromising tactical decision-making. Bonhart displayed similar analytical coldness during engagements, watching opponents with the concentrated attention of a natural philosopher observing specimen behavior, adjusting his approach based on revealed information about their capabilities and limitations. His movements incorporated economy of motion characteristic of Witcher training, eliminating flourishes or unnecessarily complex maneuvers in favor of direct solutions to tactical problems. The positioning and footwork demonstrated awareness of angles and distance management that required either extensive study of advanced swordsmanship or direct exposure to schools that taught such refinements as foundational principles. The central question raised by these observations concerned the source of such exceptional ability in someone lacking the mutations that elevated Witchers beyond normal human parameters. Several possibilities existed within the realm of plausibility, though none provided entirely satisfactory explanation for the complete package of skills Bonhart demonstrated. Intensive training beginning in early childhood and continuing throughout decades could produce remarkable technical mastery, particularly if instruction came from truly exceptional teachers and the student possessed both natural talent and obsessive dedication. Extensive combat experience, accumulated through years of survival in situations where defeat meant death, refined instincts and tactical judgment to levels that compensated partially for physical limitations. Study of Witcher techniques through whatever means available, whether through observation of Witchers in combat, acquisition of training manuals, interrogation of Witcher school dropouts, or other methods of obtaining privileged knowledge, might allow a dedicated student to incorporate principles and methods into their personal style. Some combination of exceptional genetic predisposition, perfect training environment, lifetime of relevant experience, and studied emulation of mutation-enhanced techniques could theoretically produce an individual approaching Witcher capabilities without requiring alchemical transformation. Yet even accounting for all these factors, the gap between mutation-enhanced ability and pure skill refinement remained significant in ways that made Bonhart's documented performances remarkable to the point of implausibility. Witcher mutations altered fundamental biological parameters, nervous system conductivity increased, muscle fiber composition shifted toward fast twitch variants capable of explosive contraction, healing factors accelerated recovery from injury, metabolic efficiency, extended endurance beyond natural limits. No amount of training could duplicate these foundational alterations to human physiology. That Bonhart managed to function at levels approaching Witcher capability through skill alone, if indeed he possessed no hidden augmentations or advantages beyond exceptional training and experience, represented an achievement possibly unique in the continent's documented history. He stood as proof that the ultimate heights of human potential, when cultivated with single-minded intensity and freed from moral constraints that limited other practitioners, could produce results that mimicked supernatural capability through purely natural means, demonstrating that the boundary between possible and impossible remained negotiable for those willing to pay whatever price mastery demanded. Beyond the martial excellence that made Bonhart exceptional among his profession's practitioners lay characteristics that defined him more fundamentally than any technical skill, qualities that transformed him from merely dangerous into something that inspired revulsion even among those accustomed to the continent's endemic violence. His psychological profile centered on sadism as the organizing principle of his personality, the lens through which he interpreted experience and the motivation underlying choices that appeared inexplicable when analyzed through conventional frameworks of self-interest or professional advancement. Where most individuals experience suffering as something to avoid or, when unavoidable, to endure with minimal exposure, Bonhart demonstrated active attraction toward pain and fear, seeking opportunities to witness and engineer scenarios that maximized both. This orientation manifested consistently across documented interactions, suggesting deeply rooted psychological architecture rather than situational cruelty or strategic intimidation employed for tactical advantage. The pleasure he derived from witnessing suffering appeared genuine rather than performed, observable in the focused attention he directed toward victims during moments of extremity. Witnesses described his concentrated observation during acts of violence, the way his flat, fish-like eyes tracked every nuance of response, cataloging gradations of pain and terror with the absorbed interest of a scholar recording experimental data. This attentiveness distinguished him from warriors who inflicted harm mechanically, viewing violence as merely instrumental to achieving objectives, or from those who experienced brief satisfaction from dominating opponents yet quickly moved past the act itself. Bonhart lingered in these moments, extending them when possible, refining his methods to maximize psychological impact alongside physical trauma. The deliberateness suggested conscious cultivation of technique, an ongoing project of perfecting approaches to breaking human beings systematically, treating cruelty as craft requiring continuous study and refinement rather than simple instinct to be indulged occasionally. What made this sadism particularly disturbing was its combination with emotional detachment, a pairing that produced effects more terrifying than rage-fueled violence or passionate hatred could generate. Anger implied loss of control, emotional investment that created vulnerabilities and introduced unpredictability into the aggressor's behavior. Bonhart displayed no such emotional engagement. His cruelty proceeded from cold observation rather than hot fury, calculated rather than impulsive, sustained rather than exhausted through cathartic release. He approached the infliction of suffering with the same methodical precision he brought to swordplay, treating each victim as an opportunity to refine technique and explore variations on established themes. This emotional vacancy meant his violence followed no conventional pattern that might allow prediction or manipulation. Victims could not appeal to mercy that did not exist, could not deflect anger that was never present, could not wait for rage to exhaust itself and create openings for escape or negotiation. The detachment rendered him implacable in ways that emotional investment never could, creating a form of controlled madness where restraint served to make violence more effective and terrifying rather than limiting its expression. The restraint itself functioned as part of the torture, demonstrating to victims that their suffering resulted from conscious choice rather than uncontrollable compulsion. Bonhart never appeared lost in frenzy or driven by needs beyond his governance. Every action emerged from deliberate decision-making, clear awareness of alternatives and selection of options that maximized harm without crossing thresholds that would end the experience prematurely. This required sophisticated understanding of human physiology and psychology, knowledge of how much damage bodies could absorb while remaining conscious, which psychological pressures produced desired responses, how to calibrate intensity to maintain victims in states of extremity without allowing descent into shock or dissociation that would diminish their capacity to experience what he inflicted. The expertise implied extensive experience and careful attention to outcomes, a career spent studying the mechanics of suffering with dedication that others might devote to mastering musical instruments or perfecting artistic techniques. Underlying these observable behaviors lay a worldview fundamentally nihilistic, stripped of the frameworks that provided most individuals with reasons to constrain their worst impulses. Bonhart appeared to recognize no moral order requiring respect, no divine judgment demanding consideration, no social contract worth honoring beyond immediate tactical necessity. The universe, as he seemed to perceive it, operated without inherent meaning or justice, populated by beings whose suffering or flourishing held no significance beyond the momentary experiences they produced. In such a cosmos, the only rational response involved pursuing whatever provided satisfaction or advantage, unconstrained by empathy, obligation, or concern for consequences extending beyond personal survival. This philosophy, if it could be termed such, permitted treatment of other humans as objects existing purely for utilization, no different from tools or resources to be exploited according to need or desire. That he happened to derive pleasure from inflicting suffering made cruelty the logical choice in situations where he possessed power over others, the natural expression of preference unhindered by ethical considerations that he regarded as delusions adopted by the weak to constrain the strong. The continent during these years had witnessed brutality on scales that numbed populations to violence, creating an environment where atrocities became mundane and suffering too common to inspire sustained attention. Warfare had swept across territories repeatedly, bringing with it all the associated horrors: villages burned, populations displaced, civilians subjected to treatment that military codes theoretically prohibited though practice rarely prevented. Bandits preyed on travelers and isolated settlements with impunity in regions where governance had collapsed. Monsters emerged from forests and ruins to feast on human populations whose defenders had perished in battles or departed for campaigns elsewhere. In this landscape of normalized violence, where merchants discussed massacres with the same tone reserved for weather conditions and parents taught children to hide from approaching armies regardless of their allegiance, Bonhart's particular sadism still managed to distinguish itself. He represented the logical endpoint of the age's moral decay, proof that even universal brutality established no floor beneath which individual depravity could not descend. Where the era's violence typically served purposes beyond itself, emerging from military necessity, economic desperation, or survival imperatives, his cruelty existed as its own justification, requiring no external rationale beyond the satisfaction it provided him. In this sense, he functioned as distilled essence of the continent's darkest tendencies, a figure who embodied in concentrated form the capacity for evil that war and chaos had revealed existed within human nature when constraints eroded and consequences ceased to enforce behavioral limits. The forces that would eventually draw Bonhart into direct collision with Ciri Fiona Ellen Rhiannon originated within the labyrinthine political machinery of Nilfgaard, the southern empire whose ambitions had repeatedly driven military campaigns northward and whose internal dynamics combined Byzantine complexity with ruthless efficiency. At the empire's apex sat Emhyr var Emreis, the white flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies, an emperor whose intelligence matched his ambition and whose long-term planning operated on timescales that extended across generations. Among his many concerns during the years following the Second War's conclusion, one particular objective commanded resources and attention disproportionate to what most observers would consider rational: locating and securing Ciri, the child-bearing elder blood whose lineage connected her both to ancient elven prophecy and, through deliberately obscured genealogical connections, to Emhyr himself. The emperor's interest in this particular child transcended normal dynastic politics or military strategy, touching on matters of prophecy, magical heredity, and plans whose full scope remained known only to select individuals within the imperial court's innermost circles. Among those trusted with significant responsibility in this endeavor stood Stefan Skellen, who bore the title of imperial coroner, a position whose official duties involved far less than its actual authority encompassed. Skellen belonged to that category of political operative who thrived in environments where formal titles concealed actual functions, where power flowed through unofficial channels, and where success required navigating competing factions within bureaucratic hierarchies that rewarded cunning over transparency. His assignment to locate and capture Ciri reflected Emhyr's confidence in his capabilities, providing resources and authorization to operate across multiple kingdoms, employ whatever assets proved necessary, and coordinate various intelligence networks toward achieving an objective the Emperor considered paramount. The task's complexity extended beyond simple manhunt logistics, requiring navigation of international politics, management of agents operating in hostile territories, and synthesis of fragmentary intelligence into actionable leads, all while maintaining operational security against the numerous parties who would benefit from knowing the Empire's interest in this particular fugitive princess. Within Nilfgaardian nobility and the upper tiers of imperial administration, factions pursued agendas that diverged significantly from official policy, creating undercurrents of conspiracy that occasionally surfaced to reshape the Empire's direction. Skellen belonged to one such faction, a coalition of nobles and officials who had concluded that Nilfgaard's future prosperity required fundamental restructuring away from absolute monarchy toward governance models that distributed power more broadly among aristocratic classes. Their vision involved transforming the empire into something resembling a democracy, though the term as they employed it bore limited relation to systems where common populations exercised meaningful political authority, referring instead to oligarchic arrangements where noble councils rather than single emperors determined imperial policy. This conspiracy necessitated extreme caution given the consequences that awaited anyone caught plotting against Emhyr's authority, requiring participants to maintain elaborate facades of loyalty while gradually positioning themselves for eventual action when circumstances permitted open moves against the existing order. Skellen's assignment to locate Ciri provided opportunity to advance the conspiracy's interests through means that simultaneously appeared to fulfill his official mandate. Rather than capturing the princess and delivering her to Emhyr as instructed, actions that would serve the Emperor's mysterious purposes and strengthen his position, Skellen determined that Ciri's permanent removal offered greater advantage to the faction seeking to undermine imperial authority. Her death would eliminate whatever role she played in Emhyr's long-term planning, potentially disrupting schemes that extended years or decades into the future, while the operation could be structured to avoid direct connection to Skellen himself, maintaining his position within the imperial hierarchy even as he worked to subvert it. This decision required hiring operatives capable of completing the assignment yet sufficiently removed from official imperial channels that their actions could be disavowed if circumstances demanded, creating the appearance that Ciri had met her end through accidents of war or banditry rather than directed assassination emerging from within Nilfgaard's own power structure. For this purpose, Skellen contracted with Leo Bonhart, whose reputation for effectiveness and complete lack of loyalty to any cause beyond personal interest made him suitable for operations requiring both skill and deniability. The instructions provided differed fundamentally from Emhyr's original mandate, directing elimination rather than capture, permanent removal rather than delivery to imperial custody. Bonhart accepted the contract on terms that provided him considerable operational latitude, freedom to approach the assignment according to his own judgment regarding methods and timing, constrained only by the ultimate requirement that Ciri not survive to reach Emhyr's hands. The payment offered reflected both the assignment's importance to Skellen's conspiracy and the difficulty inherent in eliminating a target who possessed not only Witcher training and access to magical abilities through her elder blood, though these remained incompletely developed and unreliably accessible, yet also the protection of various parties interested in her survival for their own purposes. That Bonhart agreed to pursue someone with Ciri's capabilities and connections suggested either confidence in his own abilities that bordered on arrogance, accurate assessment of the considerable advantages he would possess through surprise and superior experience, or simple indifference to risks that would dissuade more cautious operators. Regardless of his reasoning, the contract's terms aligned his immediate interests with Skellen's conspiracy, setting in motion a pursuit that would entangle Ciri in violence far exceeding the considerable dangers she had already survived, bringing her into direct confrontation with perhaps the most dangerous unmutated human operating across the continent's war-torn territories during those blood-soaked years. While imperial conspiracies unfolded in Nilfgaard's distant courts and professional hunters accepted contracts whose full implications extended into dynastic politics and prophecy, Cyrilla herself had found temporary refuge among a group operating at the opposite end of the social spectrum from emperors and coroners. The Rats, as this particular band styled themselves, consisted of young outlaws who had established operations in the region surrounding Giso, a territory sufficiently remote from major power centers and disrupted enough by recent warfare that local authorities lacked the resources or motivation to suppress their activities effectively. The gang had coalesced through the usual processes that formed such groups during periods of social breakdown, individuals fleeing various circumstances that made conventional life untenable, drawn together by necessity and opportunity, gradually developing the organizational structure and shared identity that transformed random fugitives into something resembling a coherent unit. Their membership skewed young, most barely past adolescence, bringing to their criminal enterprise the particular combination of recklessness, loyalty to peers, and incomplete understanding of consequences that characterized that transitional stage between childhood and whatever maturity the harsh realities of their chosen lifestyle might eventually produce. The Rats' operations focused primarily on activities that allowed them to position themselves, at least in their own understanding, as something more romantic than common bandits. They targeted wealthy travelers and merchants whose losses would not inspire sympathy among common populations already resentful of economic disparities widened by war's disruptions. They occasionally redistributed portions of their takings to peasants and townspeople in their operational territory, creating networks of support or at least tolerance that complicated efforts by authorities to track their movements or gather intelligence about their activities. This approach to banditry, emphasizing theft from the wealthy rather than preying indiscriminately on all potential targets, reflected both practical calculation about sustaining operations in a region where cooperation from local populations proved valuable, and genuine ideological commitments to notions of justice that justified their actions as redistribution rather than simple theft. Whether the peasants who received occasional portions of stolen goods regarded the Rats as benefactors or simply as a marginally preferable alternative to other predatory forces operating in the region remained ambiguous, though the gang interpreted any lack of active resistance as endorsement of their self-assigned role. Among the Rats' membership, informal hierarchies had emerged based on personality, competence, and the complex social dynamics that develop within any group spending extended time in close proximity under stressful conditions. Giselher functioned as the de facto leader, his combination of confidence, decisiveness, and charisma sufficient to maintain cohesion among personalities that might otherwise have fragmented into competing factions or dissolved entirely under the pressures of their lifestyle. Missile occupied a position of particular importance within the group structure, her competence in combat and planning earning respect that translated into influence over collective decisions. Other members each contributed specific capabilities that made the gang's operations viable, individuals skilled at tracking and reconnaissance, others proficient with particular weapons or tactics, some possessing knowledge of local geography and contacts that provided the intelligence necessary to identify promising targets and avoid organized resistance. Together, they represented a functional if precarious enterprise, successful enough to survive where many similar groups had been eliminated or dispersed, yet never sufficiently threatening to provoke the kind of concerted response from authorities that would require them to either disband or face destruction. Local law enforcement had largely adopted policies of tolerance toward the Rats' activities, reflecting calculations about resource allocation and political priorities rather than approval of banditry as acceptable practice. The gang's focus on wealthy targets meant they created problems primarily for merchants and nobles, categories of victims whose complaints, while noted, competed with more urgent concerns about reconstruction, managing displaced populations, and maintaining basic order in territories still recovering from military occupation. The limited resources available to town guards and regional militias required prioritization, directing enforcement efforts toward threats that endangered broader populations or undermined fundamental governance functions, relegating pursuit of bandits who primarily inconvenienced the wealthy to lower priority status. Additionally, the Rats' occasional redistribution of stolen wealth created political complications for aggressive enforcement, as attempts to eliminate the gang risked provoking resentment among peasant populations who benefited from those redistributions and might view such enforcement as protecting the rich at the expense of the poor. These dynamics created operating space where the rats could function with relative security as long as they maintained their pattern of selective targeting and avoided crossing thresholds that would force authorities to respond regardless of resource constraints or political complications. Into this environment came Ciri, arriving through circumstances that had already forced her through numerous identities and traumatic experiences, seeking any refuge that offered temporary safety from the multiple forces pursuing her across the continent. The rats accepted her integration into their group, where she adopted the alias Falca, a name carrying its own dark historical resonance that reflected something of her psychological state during this period. Her relationship with Missile developed into an emotional attachment that provided anchor during months when her sense of identity and purpose had fragmented under the accumulated weight of loss, displacement, and the terrible knowledge of her significance to powers beyond her control or full comprehension. The rats became something approaching surrogate family for a princess whose actual family existed scattered across political divides and magical barriers, offering belonging to someone who had been forcibly separated from every previous connection that might have provided stability or protection. That this found family consisted of young criminals living under constant threat of violence and operating outside all legal frameworks perhaps spoke to how far Ciri had fallen from her origins in Sintra nobility, or alternatively revealed something about the arbitrary nature of legitimacy in a world where kingdoms rose and fell through violence that differed from banditry primarily in scale and the official sanction that accompanied state-sponsored force. For a time measured in months rather than years, the rats provided Ciri with purpose, companionship, and the dangerous illusion that she might escape her destiny through simple anonymity among those whose concerns remained bounded by immediate survival rather than prophecy or imperial politics. That illusion would not survive the winter. The relative tranquility that had allowed the rats to operate with impunity and provided Ciri temporary refuge began deteriorating as multiple parties pursuing independent agendas converged their attention toward the same territory. The search for Cirilla had intensified as various factions received intelligence suggesting her presence in regions where the rats maintained their operations, transforming what had been a sanctuary into a trap whose walls were closing with inexorable precision. Each hunting party brought different motivations, resources, and intentions regarding what would occur should they successfully locate their quarry, creating a complex situation where Ciri faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously, each requiring different responses and offering no clear path towards safety that would not place her in the grasp of some party whose purposes ran counter to her survival or freedom. Stefan Skellen's contract with Leo Bonhart represented one vector of this converging threat, carrying with it the full weight of imperial resources directed through unofficial channels toward an objective that contradicted official imperial policy. Bonhart received payment, intelligence support, and authorization to operate across jurisdictional boundaries that would normally constrain even professional bounty hunters, advantages that significantly enhanced his already formidable capabilities. The instructions remained clear despite being concealed from Imhir's awareness. Locate Ciri and ensure her permanent removal from whatever roles she might otherwise play in the unfolding conflicts between empires, prophecies, and magical lineages. Bonhart approached this assignment with the methodical patience that characterized his most successful operations, gathering information about the rats' movements and habits, identifying their likely refuges and patterns, building a comprehensive understanding of the target environment before committing to direct action that would expose his presence and potentially alert his quarry to the immediate danger. Complicating this already dangerous situation, another contract had been issued by the Baron of Cassidy, whose interests in Ciri stemmed from different motivations and specified different outcomes. Where Skellen's conspiracy required elimination, the Baron's purposes demanded capture and delivery, preserving Ciri's life while securing her person for transfer to whoever had retained the Baron's services, an identity that remained unclear in available sources, though the distinction between capture and elimination proved significant regardless of ultimate patron. This divergence in objectives created potential for conflict between hunting parties should they converge on the target simultaneously, introducing additional unpredictability into an already volatile situation. The Baron's resources, while perhaps less extensive than those available through Skellen's imperial connections, nonetheless provided meaningful support for tracking operations, including access to local informants and the ability to offer rewards that motivated independent operators to report relevant intelligence. Bonhart's response to these conflicting contracts revealed the autonomous decision-making that characterized his operations and distinguished him from more conventional hired operatives who followed instructions with greater fidelity. Rather than adhering strictly to either mandate, he recognized opportunity in the situation's ambiguity, maintaining flexibility regarding Ciri's ultimate fate while pursuing her location with single-minded focus. This approach allowed him to accept payment from multiple sources while reserving judgment about which contract he would ultimately honor, or whether he might devise an outcome serving his own interests rather than any employer's specifications. The freedom to operate according to personal judgment, constrained only by the requirement of eventually producing some result that could be represented as fulfilling at least one contract's terms, gave him latitude that more rigidly controlled hunters would lack, permitting adaptation to developing circumstances rather than commitment to predetermined courses of action that might prove suboptimal as situations evolved. The tracking methods employed by professional hunters during this era combined traditional woodcraft with intelligence gathering, creating comprehensive approaches that gradually narrowed search parameters until targets found themselves operating in increasingly constrained spaces. Bonhart utilized informant networks developed over years of operation, contacts among merchants, innkeepers, town guards, and criminals who traded information for payment or favors that might prove valuable in future transactions. He analyzed patterns in reported sightings and rumors, distinguishing reliable intelligence from the noise of false leads and exaggerated tales that always surrounded figures of interest. Physical tracking supplemented these intelligence efforts where circumstances permitted, reading signs in traveled routes and abandoned campsites, interpreting evidence that revealed group size, movement patterns, and the general direction of travel. The combination of methods proved effective at reducing the search space progressively, eliminating territories where the target demonstrably was not present, identifying regions where probability of contact increased sufficiently to justify direct reconnaissance. Among the rats themselves, growing awareness of being pursued manifested in subtle changes to operational patterns and increasing tensions within the group. Reports reached them through their own networks of supporters and informants, warnings that strangers had been asking questions, that rewards had been offered for information about their movements, that professional hunters with fearsome reputations had been observed in regions adjacent to their usual territories. Giselha's responses to these warnings reflected the particular combination of arrogance and incomplete understanding of danger that would ultimately contribute to the gang's destruction. He dismissed concerns as exaggerated, maintained confidence in the rat's ability to evade or defeat whatever threats materialized, and continued operations according to established patterns rather than implementing more cautious approaches that might have extended their survival at the cost of reduced activity and income. This failure to properly assess the threat level proved characteristic of young criminals whose limited experience had not yet taught them to distinguish between ordinary risks they had successfully managed and extraordinary dangers requiring fundamentally different responses. For Ciri, the period preceding Bonhart's assault carried the weight of precognitive anxiety, her sensitivity to danger and connection to forces beyond normal perception providing warnings that she struggled to interpret clearly. Dreams troubled her sleep, vague impressions of pursuit and violence that lacked the specificity to enable effective preparation yet carried emotional weight sufficient to maintain constant tension. Her suggestions that the rats exercise greater caution, alter their patterns, or even temporarily disperse until whatever threat approached had passed or revealed itself more clearly met with mixed reception among the gang's membership, some recognizing the validity of her concerns while others, particularly Giselha, dismissed them as paranoia or attempts to undermine his leadership. The convergence of hunter and prey proceeded toward its inevitable conclusion, one party moving with calculated patience toward a target whose location grew more precisely defined with each passing day, the other maintaining routines that had served them adequately in the past though circumstances had changed in ways they failed to fully recognize until recognition came too late to enable survival. The town where the rats had chosen to establish temporary quarters bore the name Jealousy, a designation whose ironic resonance would become apparent only after events had concluded and survivors attempted to reconstruct what had occurred during those winter hours when Leo Bonhart finally executed the contract that had brought him across half the continent. The settlement itself possessed no particular strategic significance, merely one among hundreds of similar communities that dotted the territories between major kingdoms, places where travelers might find lodging, merchants could conduct modest trade, and those seeking to avoid attention might rest with reasonable expectation that local authorities lacked both the resources and motivation to investigate every stranger passing through. For the rats, jealousy represented a familiar refuge, a location where they had stayed previously without incident, where contacts provided early warning of approaching threats, and where the physical layout offered multiple escape routes should circumstances require rapid departure. This familiarity bred a degree of complacency that would prove catastrophic when faced with an opponent who had studied their patterns and prepared specifically for the scenario that was about to unfold. Bonhart's approach to the assault reflected the methodical planning that characterized his most effective operations. He had observed the building where the rats sheltered, mapped the exits and approaches, identified sight lines and positions that would provide tactical advantage, and waited for circumstances that maximized his advantages while minimizing opportunities for his targets to coordinate effective resistance or escape. The attack commenced with swift efficiency that gave the rats no time to properly assess the threat or organize defensive responses adequate to the danger they faced. Bonhart moved through the building with precision that suggested either detailed prior reconnaissance or uncanny ability to navigate unfamiliar spaces while maintaining tactical awareness, engaging targets in sequence that prevented mutual support and eliminated the gang's most capable fighters before others fully comprehended what was occurring. The elimination of each rat proceeded with brutal efficiency that left no ambiguity about the outcome once Bonhart engaged. His blade work demonstrated the exceptional skill that had earned his fearsome reputation, striking with accuracy that found vital targets even against opponents attempting desperate defensive maneuvers, transitioning between targets with fluid economy that wasted no motion on flourishes or unnecessary complexity. The gang members' youth and limited combat experience against opponents of Bonhart's caliber became apparent as the assault progressed, their techniques adequate for confrontations with town guards or rival criminals yet utterly insufficient against someone operating at levels approaching Witcher capability. Those who attempted to flee found exits blocked or covered, escape routes anticipated and countered before they could be utilized. Those who stood to fight discovered that courage and willingness to engage provided no advantage against someone whose speed, precision, and tactical awareness exceeded theirs across every dimension of martial competence. Giselha's arrogance and overconfidence, traits that had shaped his leadership of the rats and informed his dismissal of warnings about pursuing hunters, contributed significantly to the gang's destruction. His initial response to Bonhart's assault reflected assumptions about the rats' collective capability to overcome individual threats through numerical advantage and coordinated action, strategies that had served adequately against previous challenges yet proved catastrophically inadequate against this particular opponent. By the time recognition of the true danger penetrated his understanding, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, with casualties already sustained eliminating the possibility of organized resistance and panic beginning to fragment whatever cohesion remained among surviving members. His own death, when Bonhart's attention finally focused on him specifically, demonstrated the vast gulf between confidence in one's abilities and actual competence when tested against genuinely exceptional opposition. The rats' inability to comprehend the threat until circumstances had progressed beyond the point where comprehension could enable survival reflected a broader pattern common among those who encountered Bonhart. His appearance, that skeletal frame and elderly features, created initial impressions that understated the danger he represented, precious seconds lost to surprise and disbelief when his actual capabilities became apparent through direct demonstration. The speed with which he eliminated trained fighters, the precision of strikes that required no second attempts to achieve lethal effect, the tactical awareness that seemed to predict defensive responses before they occurred, all combined to create paralysis born from the cognitive disconnect between expectation and observed reality. By the time targets adjusted their threat assessment to match what they were witnessing, Bonhart had already positioned himself advantageously for continuing the engagement, maintaining initiative that prevented opponents from establishing any rhythm of coordinated counteraction. Missel's fate at Bonhart's hands removed from Ciri the single most important emotional anchor she had developed during her time with the rats. The specific details of her final moments, like those of other gang members, followed the pattern of swift, efficient violence that Bonhart employed when operational requirements called for elimination rather than interrogation or capture. Her death represented not merely the loss of a companion within a criminal enterprise, though that alone would have carried significant weight, yet something more fundamental to Ciri's psychological state during this period of displacement and fragmentation. Missile had provided connection that helped Ciri maintain some coherence of self when circumstances threatened to dissolve identity entirely, offering relationship that grounded her in immediate reality rather than allowing complete loss in the currents of destiny and prophecy that pulled her toward futures she could neither fully comprehend nor effectively resist. The aftermath of Bonhart's assault included actions that exceeded operational necessity, revealing the sadistic dimensions of his character even within the context of a massacre. The preservation of heads and barrels, trophies taken from the deceased, demonstrated both methodical planning that included preparation for such collection and deliberate choice to invest time and effort in activities serving no strategic purpose beyond his personal satisfaction. These remains would serve specific functions in his subsequent interactions with Ciri: physical evidence of destruction he had wrought, tools for psychological torture that would accompany her captivity. When Ciri finally arrived at the scene, delayed by circumstances that had taken her elsewhere during the crucial hours, she found only the evidence of comprehensive destruction, the preserved remains of companions who had provided temporary family, and the beginning of understanding that the forces pursuing her across the continent had achieved what she had feared yet failed to prevent through her warnings and precognitive anxieties. The winter wind moved through Jealous's empty streets, carrying away the last traces of smoke from fires that had burned during the assault, leaving silence broken only by Ciri's grief and the distant sound of Bonhart's departure with his captive prizes, heading toward confrontations that would determine whether the rat's destruction represented merely one tragedy among countless others or the prelude to something far more personally catastrophic for the sole survivor of that winter night. The confrontation between Bonhart and Ciri occurred after she had discovered the remains of the rats, her emotional state already compromised by grief and rage that diminished the tactical clarity necessary for optimal performance against an opponent of his caliber. She approached the encounter with the training received at Kaer Morhen, techniques drilled into muscle memory through countless repetitions under the instruction of witches who had survived centuries of combat against monsters and humans alike. Yet those advantages proved insufficient when facing someone whose experience exceeded hers by decades and whose emotional detachment provided immunity to the psychological pressures that might have destabilized less disciplined fighters. The duel between them demonstrated the distance between competent training and mastery refined through lifetime application, between theoretical knowledge of combat principles and practical wisdom gained through surviving encounters that would have ended most careers permanently. Bonhart's approach to the engagement reflected neither haste nor hesitation, his movements calibrated to probe Ciri's capabilities while maintaining defensive integrity that prevented her from exploiting openings that less experienced observers might have mistaken for vulnerabilities. He studied her technique during the initial exchanges, reading the Witcher influence in her footwork and blade work, recognizing the classical forms underlying her attacks and adjusting his responses accordingly. His counters arrived with timing that disrupted her rhythm, forcing reactive defensive maneuvers that prevented her from establishing offensive sequences capable of pressuring him meaningfully. The accumulated advantages of experience, superior physical conditioning despite his apparent age, and complete emotional control gradually tilted the engagement toward inevitable conclusion. Ciri's capabilities impressive for someone her age and training duration, yet ultimately inadequate against opposition operating at the levels Bonhart routinely demonstrated. Her defeat, when it arrived, came through accumulated small disadvantages rather than single catastrophic error, the gradual erosion of position and energy that characterized fights between skilled opponents where one possessed decisive edge in fundamental competence. Bonhart's blade found openings that her defense could not quite cover, strikes that inflicted damage insufficient to immediately incapacitate yet accumulated toward exhaustion and compromised movement. Her own attacks, when they managed to threaten him at all, met responses that minimized damage and immediately repositioned him advantageously for continuing pressure. The outcome had ceased being uncertain well before the actual conclusion, though Ciri's determination prolonged the engagement past the point where more pragmatic fighters might have attempted surrender or flight, her emotional investment in avenging the rats overriding tactical judgment about when continued resistance served no purpose beyond hastening more severe injury. The critical decision facing Bonhart following Ciri's defeat involved choosing between the contracts that had brought him to this confrontation, yet his actions demonstrated that neither option aligned with his actual intentions. Skellen's instructions called for elimination, permanent removal of Ciri from whatever roles she might play in unfolding political and prophetic schemes, a straightforward solution that Bonhart possessed both capability and authorization to implement immediately. The Baron's contract specified capture and delivery, preserving her life while transferring custody to parties whose purposes remained ambiguous though clearly divergent from Skellen's conspiracy. Bonhart selected a third option entirely, deviation from both contracts that served neither employer's interests yet aligned perfectly with his own inclinations and curiosities. He chose to retain Ciri as personal captive, maintaining her survival while preventing her delivery to any party, claiming her as property acquired through victory rather than merchandise to be transferred according to contractual obligations. The psychological motivations underlying this decision revealed dimensions of Bonhart's character extending beyond simple mercenary self-interest or sadistic opportunism. His recognition of Witcher fighting techniques in Ciri's movements had sparked genuine curiosity, questions about her training's origins and the extent of her capabilities that could only be explored through extended observation and experimentation. Someone bearing elder blood yet demonstrating combat skills characteristic of Witcher education represented an anomaly worthy of investigation, a puzzle whose solution might provide insights or advantages that transcended the immediate financial rewards offered by either existing contract. Additionally, the opportunity to possess someone simultaneously valuable to multiple powerful factions, to exercise control over an individual whose significance exceeded normal parameters of importance, appealed to inclinations toward domination that found fuller expression through extended captivity than through swift elimination or simple transfer to employers. Bonhart's sadistic interest in breaking and reshaping Ciri constituted perhaps the most significant motivation driving his decision to deviate from contractual obligations. She represented not merely a target or a commodity, categories that exhausted most bounty hunters' conceptual frameworks for relating to their quarry, yet something more personally engaging, a project, a canvas upon which he could exercise his particular expertise in dismantling psychological integrity and reconstructing identity according to patterns that served his purposes. Her youth, her evident trauma from recent losses, her significance to forces she could neither fully control nor escape, all combined to create ideal conditions for the systematic abuse that would characterize her captivity. The technical challenge of breaking someone with her training and inherent capabilities added intellectual dimension to what might otherwise have been merely routine cruelty, elevating the endeavor from simple sadism into something approaching craft. The binding to a pillar that initiated Ciri's captivity established physical dominance while simultaneously introducing the primary instrument of psychological torture that would accompany her imprisonment. Bonhart arranged Missel's preserved remains within Ciri's sight, positioning the evidence of his massacre where she could not avoid confronting it, where the physical reality of her failure to protect those she had cared for remained constantly present. This demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological torment, recognition that physical abuse alone, while effective, achieved greater impact when accompanied by emotional dimensions that prevented victims from retreating into mental spaces offering respite from bodily suffering. The preserved remains served multiple functions: proof of his capabilities, warning about consequences of resistance, and perpetual reminder of loss that maintained fresh grief and prevented healing through time's normal processes. Winter settled over the landscape as Bonhart began the systematic project of dismantling the princess who had survived so much already, testing whether her resilience possessed limits that sufficient application of expertise could discover and exploit, transforming her from the child of destiny into something that served his purposes rather than prophecy's inscrutable designs. The systematic abuse that characterized Ciri's captivity under Bonhart's control followed patterns refined through whatever prior experience had taught him optimal methods for maintaining dominance over prisoners while extracting maximum psychological impact from their suffering. Physical beatings arrived with regularity sufficient to maintain constant awareness of vulnerability, yet calibrated to avoid damage that would compromise her long-term utility for whatever purposes he had determined she would serve. The timing of these sessions varied deliberately, preventing her from developing rhythms that might allow psychological preparation or anticipation that could reduce their effectiveness. Sometimes they followed immediately after previous abuse, denying recovery time and compounding exhaustion with fresh trauma. Other occasions they arrived after extended intervals that permitted hope's tentative emergence, hope that circumstances might improve or patterns might shift, before demonstrating through renewed violence that such optimism existed only at his sufferance and could be revoked whenever he chose. Bonhart's introduction of Fistek into this regimen of abuse represented particularly calculated cruelty that combined pharmacological knowledge with psychological expertise. Fistek functioned as one of the continent's most powerful narcotics, a white powder whose consumption produced intense euphoria, heightened sensory experiences, and profound alterations to consciousness that users described as transcendent yet which carried severe addictive properties and destructive long-term consequences. Its use had spread throughout both northern kingdoms and Nilfgaardian territories, creating populations of addicts whose dependence could be exploited by those controlling supply. In controlled doses administered to captives, Fistek served multiple purposes that aligned perfectly with Bonhart's objectives. The drug induced states of euphoric compliance that made resistance psychologically difficult, overlaying suffering with sensations that confused the mind's ability to maintain clear distinction between pleasure and pain, creating associations that compromised victims' understanding of their own experiences and responses. The drugging maintained Ciri in conditions that prevented effective planning of escape or resistance, while simultaneously introducing chemical dimensions to her captivity that would persist beyond any eventual physical liberation. Fistek's addictive properties meant that repeated administration created physiological dependencies, the body adapting to the drug's presence and experiencing distressing symptoms during its absence, symptoms that included anxiety, physical discomfort, and profound psychological distress that could only be relieved through renewed consumption. This dependency provided Bonhart with leverage extending beyond immediate physical control, creating within Ciri herself mechanisms that would work against her own interests, internal compulsions towards seeking the substance whose use facilitated her continued abuse. The strategic sophistication of employing addiction as control mechanism demonstrated planning that looked beyond present circumstances toward maintaining influence even if direct physical custody somehow ended, ensuring that his impact would persist through biological processes he had deliberately initiated. Beyond the physical beatings and chemical subjugation, Bonhart employed psychological torture through constant verbal abuse that targeted Ciri's sense of identity, worth, and agency. His goading took forms calculated to maximize psychological damage, focusing on themes that resonated with existing traumas and insecurities accumulated through her experiences prior to captivity. He referenced the rats' destruction repeatedly, emphasizing her failure to protect them, suggesting that her presence had drawn the danger that ultimately destroyed them, framing their deaths as consequences of association with her rather than results of his own deliberate actions. He taunted her about her significance to various factions pursuing her, reducing destiny and prophecy to sources of mockery rather than meaning, presenting her importance to others as proof of her lack of inherent value, suggesting she functioned merely as object to be utilized by forces that cared nothing for her as individual. These verbal assaults carried weight precisely because they exploited genuine vulnerabilities in Ciri's psychological state, touching on doubts and fears that possessed foundation in her actual circumstances rather than being entirely fabricated provocations. Bonhart's observations of Ciri's deteriorating state proceeded with the focused attention he brought to all exercises of cruelty, watching how the combined effects of physical abuse, narcotic dependency, and psychological assault eroded her resistance and reshaped her responses. He tracked changes in her demeanor, noting when defiance gave way to compliance, when active resistance became passive endurance, when attempts to maintain identity through remembered connections to her past life faltered under the weight of present suffering. These observations served both immediate tactical purposes, informing adjustments to his methods that maintained optimal pressure without pushing her past thresholds into complete psychological dissolution that would render her useless for his purposes, and longer-term strategic interests regarding how thoroughly he could reshape someone with her background and inherent capabilities into something that served his intentions rather than her own. For Ciri, the internal struggle between resistance and despair played out in consciousness increasingly compromised by Fisdecker's effects and the accumulated trauma of sustained abuse. Her training at Kaer Morhen had included preparation for hardship and pain, instruction in maintaining mental discipline under adverse conditions, techniques for preserving core identity when circumstances threatened to overwhelm personality's coherence. Those preparations proved inadequate against the specific combination of chemical, physical, and psychological assault that Bonhart employed, methodologies that seemed designed specifically to defeat the mental fortifications that Witcher training attempted to construct. The Fisdeck particularly undermined her ability to maintain clear thought and consistent resolve, its euphoric effects making each moment of respite from active abuse feel like relief rather than merely temporary cessation of suffering, gradually conditioning her nervous system to associate his presence and control with the drug's pleasurable sensations rather than only with pain and degradation. The winter deepened around whatever location Bonhart had chosen for maintaining his captive, snow accumulating in drifts that isolated them further from potential intervention or rescue. Time measured not in days or weeks, yet in the cycles of abuse and drug-induced compliance that constituted Ciri's existence during this period, when the Child of Destiny discovered that prophecy provided no protection against human cruelty applied with expertise and unrestrained by any consideration beyond the captor's satisfaction and curiosity about how thoroughly a person could be broken when sufficient skill and resources addressed the task systematically. The journey to Fëanor marked a transition in Ciri's captivity from pure imprisonment toward preparation for purposes that Bonhart had conceived during his observation of her capabilities and deteriorating psychological state. Fëanor itself possessed reputation as center for specialized craftsmanship, particularly in the production of weapons whose quality attracted buyers willing to pay premium prices for blades that exceeded the standard offerings available through common armories or traveling merchants. Among the city's weapon merchants, one establishment commanded particular respect from those knowledgeable about superior steel and the subtle distinctions separating adequate swords from exceptional ones. Esterhazy's shop occupied premises that reflected generations of accumulated expertise, walls displaying examples of the smith's art ranging from practical military blades to ornate ceremonial pieces whose decoration nonetheless did not compromise functional effectiveness. Esterhazy himself represented the tradition of master craftsmen whose knowledge extended beyond mere technical competence in forging metal into shapes suitable for violence. His expertise encompassed understanding of metallurgy, familiarity with various schools of swordsmanship and their differing requirements in weapon characteristics, and networks of contacts that provided access to materials and specialist techniques unavailable to less established artisans. The shop's inventory included weapons acquired from distant sources alongside pieces produced in Esterhazy's own workshop, creating a collection that served both as gallery demonstrating the proprietor's discernment and as practical marketplace where serious buyers could examine options reflecting the full range of quality and style available across the continent's fragmented yet interconnected martial cultures. Bonhart's commission of a special blade for Ciri indicated planning that extended beyond her immediate utility as captive subject for abuse, suggesting intentions that required her armed and capable of demonstrating the combat skills he had identified during their initial duel. His selection criteria focused on weapons classified as gwaihir, a term designating swords of exceptional quality whose characteristics made them suitable for wielders whose skill level justified investment in superior equipment. The specific blade that captured his attention among Esterhazy's offerings bore provenance tracing to gnomic craftsmanship, traditions whose reputation for producing weapons of remarkable quality rested on metallurgical knowledge and manufacturing techniques that remained partially mysterious to human smiths despite centuries of attempts to fully replicate their methods. The sword's history extended 2 centuries into the past, forged in workshops located in Ter Tocher by artisans whose names had been lost to time, though their work endured as testament to capabilities that exceeded contemporary standards. Its construction utilized dark iron, metal whose specific properties differentiated it from more common steel alloys, providing combination of edge retention, flexibility, and durability that made properly forged dark iron blades prized possessions among professional fighters. The blade itself displayed flame-shaped profile, subtle curves, and tapers that served both aesthetic purposes and functional advantages in penetration and cutting mechanics. 200 years of existence had not diminished its quality, the gnomic metallurgy and construction methods producing weapon that aged gracefully when properly maintained, acquiring patina and history without suffering the degradation that rendered lesser blades unsuitable for serious combat after decades of use. The sword's value reflected both its material quality and its rarity, expensive enough that its purchase represented significant expenditure even for someone with Bonhart's accumulated wealth from years of lucrative contracts. Precious weapons occupied peculiar position in economic systems that assigned worth to objects based on combination of practical utility, scarcity, and symbolic significance. For professional fighters, superior blades provided concrete advantages that could determine outcomes in situations where marginal differences in weapon performance translated directly into survival or death. For collectors and those concerned with status, rare swords functioned as stores of value and markers of wealth that communicated social position. Bonhart's willingness to invest resources in acquiring this particular blade for Ciri rather than selecting adequate though less distinguished alternatives suggested purposes that valued the specific qualities this guerrier offered, characteristics that would become relevant only in contexts where Ciri would employ the weapon under circumstances demanding genuine performance rather than merely symbolic possession. The reasons underlying Bonhart's choice to arm his captive with such exceptional weaponry revealed dimensions of his plans that connected her systematic abuse and chemical dependency to future scenarios requiring her active participation rather than passive suffering. A sword of this quality made sense only if he intended to place Ciri in situations where she would fight, where the blade's superior characteristics would manifest through actual combat rather than remaining theoretical advantages appreciated only by connoisseurs. This implied contexts where her defeat would not serve his purposes, where he required her victory or at least capable performance, suggesting plans to display her abilities before audiences whose reactions would provide him satisfaction beyond what private abuse could achieve. The sword represented investment in his captive's combat effectiveness, recognition that the systematic degradation of her psychological state through abuse and addiction needed to be balanced against maintenance of the physical and technical capabilities that made her interesting to him. When Ciri eventually named the blade Zira El, a word in Elder speech translating to swallow, she invested the weapon with significance that Bonhart likely neither anticipated nor cared about, her choice of name revealing something about her internal state during captivity. Swallows carried associations with freedom, migration, and return, birds that traveled vast distances yet found their way back to origins, creatures whose movement through air suggested escape from earthbound constraints. The name functioned as small assertion of agency in circumstances where agency had been systematically stripped away, a claim of ownership over object that Bonhart had provided yet which became hers through the act of naming. Subtle resistance expressed through language and symbolic association rather than through defiant actions that would invite immediate punishment. The sword's symbolic significance as preparation for the arena, tool chosen specifically for purposes that would serve Bonhart's entertainment and satisfy his curiosity about how far he could push someone bearing elder blood and witcher training while maintaining their capability to perform lethally, would only become fully apparent when they arrived at Claremont and she discovered the full scope of the role he had assigned her within his cousin's illicit establishment, where audiences gathered to witness violence and wagered on outcomes while combatants fought for survival or at least for temporary respite from conditions even worse than the arena itself represented. The journey's destination revealed itself as Claremont, a settlement whose location in the provinces offered sufficient distance from major administrative centers to permit enterprises that more closely governed territories would prohibit or suppress. The town existed in that category of places where official authority maintained only nominal presence, where local power structures operated with practical autonomy as long as they avoided provocations that would justify intervention from regional lords or royal representatives. In such environments, activities that violated legal codes or moral standards common across most civilized territories could flourish through combination of geographic isolation, corrupt or complicit local officials, and economic incentives that made populations willing to tolerate operations they might otherwise oppose. Claremont had developed around several such enterprises, its economy dependent on businesses that existed in legal grey zones or ventured into outright criminality while maintaining facades of legitimacy sufficient to avoid concentrated suppression efforts. Among Claremont's more successful residents operated Hoevernagel, whose relationship to Bonhart as cousin provided family connection between two individuals whose careers followed parallel trajectories in exploiting opportunities created by weak governance and populations desensitized to violence. Hoevernagel had established himself as merchant and entrepreneur, designations that encompassed legitimate trade alongside ventures whose legality remained questionable and activities that clearly violated statutes though enforcement proved intermittent or non-existent. His primary enterprise of immediate relevance to Ciri's captivity centered on management of an arena where bloodsport entertainment drew audiences from Claremont and surrounding territories, patrons willing to pay for the particular entertainment that watching humans fight to injury or death provided to populations whose moral sensibilities had been shaped by decades of warfare and normalized brutality. Hoevernagel's other business interests extended into land acquisition schemes that revealed the entrepreneurial creativity that characterized successful operators in regions where conventional commerce competed with more predatory economic models. The Northern Kingdom's territorial reorganization following the Second War's conclusion had created opportunities for those positioned to exploit administrative chaos and populations desperate enough to accept unfavorable terms in exchange for immediate relief from pressing problems. Hoevernagel had developed mechanisms for acquiring northern territories through contracts that technically appeared legitimate yet functioned as tools for dispossessing property owners who lacked resources to contest terms or understand implications of agreements they signed under duress. These schemes required network of collaborators including corrupt officials willing to certify transfers, enforcers capable of removing resistant parties who challenged acquisitions, and legal expertise sufficient to construct frameworks that would withstand casual scrutiny while achieving fundamentally predatory objectives. Bonhart's potential role in these land acquisition schemes remained somewhat ambiguous in available sources, though the cousin relationship and Bonhart's capabilities suggested probable involvement in aspects requiring intimidation or removal of obstacles that resisted through legal or extralegal means. Professional hunters with reputations for effectiveness and brutality provided valuable services to enterprises that occasionally required problems solved through violence or credible threat thereof, maintaining plausible deniability for principals who preferred to avoid direct association with methods their business models necessitated. Whether Bonhart participated actively in Hoevernagel's land schemes or merely maintained relationship that provided both cousins with useful connections and mutual support remained unclear, though the family tie and complementary skill sets suggested collaboration that benefited both parties beyond the immediate context of Ciri's captivity. The arena itself functioned as Claremont's primary attraction, drawing visitors whose attendance supported an entire ecosystem of supporting businesses from lodging establishments to gambling operations that organized wagering on combat outcomes. Gladiatorial combat occupied ambiguous legal status across the continent's various jurisdictions, with specific prohibitions varying between kingdoms and enforcement dependent on local circumstances and priorities. In regions where central authority had weakened or where officials could be bribed or intimidated into ignoring violations, arenas operated openly or with minimal pretense at concealment. Claremont's distance from seats of power and the economic benefits the arena generated for local populations created an environment where Hoevernagel's establishment functioned essentially without interference, authorities either complicit through corruption or simply unwilling to invest resources in suppressing activity that much of the local population accepted or actively supported. The audience composition revealed something about the social dynamics that made such entertainment viable and profitable. Wealthy merchants seeking diversions unavailable in more civilized locales, minor nobles whose tastes ran toward spectacles forbidden in their home territories, soldiers and mercenaries who found in the arena echoes of battlefield experiences, criminals and outcasts who gathered wherever law enforcement maintained light touch. All these categories comprised the crowds that filled Hoevernagel's establishment when featured combats promised particularly interesting matchups or when rumors spread about exceptional fighters whose skills elevated bouts above the typical brutality that characterized most arena violence. The economic structure supporting the arena relied heavily on gambling, with spectators wagering significant sums on outcomes, creating financial stakes that intensified emotional investment in fights and ensured that audiences remained engaged throughout events that might otherwise lose interest through repetitive violence. The betting mechanisms had evolved into sophisticated systems that offered various wagering options beyond simple predictions of which combatant would survive. Gamblers could bet on specific outcomes, duration of fights, particular injuries inflicted, whether combatants would attempt surrender or fight to complete incapacitation, creating complex marketplace of odds and potential returns that attracted those seeking both entertainment and possibility of financial gain through accurate assessment of fighters' capabilities and likely tactical decisions during combat. The accumulated wagering on any given evening's events represented substantial sums, providing Hoevennagel with percentage revenues that made the arena profitable beyond simple admission charges, creating economic incentives to maintain steady supply of combatants and to occasionally feature fighters whose exceptional abilities generated elevated betting volumes and corresponding increases in the house's percentage earnings. Into this environment Bonhart brought Ciri, prisoner he had systematically abused and addicted to fistek, armed now with Zera L and designated for role as featured attraction whose Witcher training and elder blood significance would provide arena audiences with combatant unlike any they had witnessed previously, her performances serving simultaneously to entertain crowds, generate gambling revenues for Hoevennagel, and satisfy Bonhart's curiosity about how the combination of her inherent capabilities, systematic degradation, and chemical dependency would manifest when she faced opponents in contexts where victory or defeat would occur before audiences whose attention would intensify every aspect of her experience within that blood-stained amphitheater. The amphitheater's physical structure reflected pragmatic design priorities that emphasized spectator visibility and combatant containment over architectural grandeur or aesthetic refinement. Stone seating arranged in tiers surrounded a central fighting space whose dimensions provided enough room for meaningful tactical movement yet remained sufficiently confined that combatants could not avoid engagement through retreat or evasion indefinitely. The arrangement ensured that audiences obtained clear views of violence unfolding below them, that subtle details of technique and the specific moments when advantage shifted from one fighter to another remained visible even to spectators in upper rows, creating viewing experience that satisfied both those seeking pure spectacle of bloodshed and more sophisticated observers capable of appreciating martial skill when displayed under such extreme conditions. The arena's floor bore stains accumulated through countless prior contests, discoloration that cleaning between events could not entirely remove, physical evidence of the structure's purpose and history written in substances that had soaked into stone beyond recovery. Forced combat as entertainment occupied contested moral territory even in an age when violence had become normalized through warfare and social breakdown. The practice drew objections from religious authorities who maintained that human life possessed inherent sanctity prohibiting its treatment as spectacle, from legal scholars who argued that such events violated principles underlying civilized governance, and from individuals whose moral sensibilities had not been completely eroded by the era's pervasive brutality. These objections carried limited practical weight in locations like Claremont, where enforcement mechanisms remained weak and economic incentives favored continuation of profitable enterprises regardless of ethical concerns. The audiences attending arena events represented self-selecting populations whose willingness to witness and financially support such violence indicated either moral frameworks that accepted gladiatorial combat as legitimate entertainment or psychological profiles that actively sought exposure to suffering and death as sources of pleasure or excitement. Bonhart's intention in bringing Ciri to this environment centered on testing her abilities publicly, transforming her from private captive whose suffering remained known only to her captor into displayed possession, whose capabilities would be demonstrated before crowds whose reactions would provide him additional satisfaction beyond what isolated abuse could generate. The public nature of arena combat added dimensions that private violence lacked, creating contexts where his dominance over someone of Ciri's significance became visible to others, where her reduction to the status of performing combatant demonstrated his power not merely to himself yet to audiences whose awareness of her performance under his control validated and amplified his sense of mastery. The arena provided stage for his particular form of cruelty, allowing him to orchestrate scenarios where Ciri's survival depended on employing the very skills that made her significant while simultaneously operating under conditions of addiction and psychological trauma that compromised her ability to utilize those capabilities optimally. The drugging of Ciri with Fistek before each fight served multiple purposes within Bonhart's carefully constructed framework of control and experimentation. The narcotic's euphoric effects created dissociation between her physical actions and emotional responses, generating states where combat occurred through trained reflexes operating somewhat independently from conscious volition or clear tactical thinking. This dissociation produced combat performances that demonstrated her technical training while simultaneously revealing the psychological fragmentation that sustained abuse and addiction had created, turning her fights into exhibitions that illustrated both her exceptional capabilities and her profound damage. The Fistek also maintained her physical dependency, ensuring that even if opportunities for escape presented themselves, her body's chemical requirements would drive her toward seeking the substance rather than simply fleeing, creating internal constraints that supplemented external control mechanisms. The euphoric state induced by pre-fight dosing meant that Ciri experienced combat through altered consciousness that blurred distinctions between horror and transcendence, creating memories whose emotional content would be difficult to process or integrate coherently into narrative understanding of her experiences. She moved through fights in conditions where pain registered differently, where fear's normal inhibiting effects became muted or transformed into sensations lacking clear negative valence, where the act of ending other humans' resistance or lives occurred in psychological spaces disconnected from moral frameworks that would normally generate guilt or trauma. This pharmacologically mediated dissociation served Bonhart's purposes by allowing Ciri to function effectively in the arena without descending into complete psychological collapse that would render her incapable of the performances he sought, maintaining her in suspended state between competence and dissolution that maximized both her utility as combatant and his satisfaction at having orchestrated such precise calibration of her degradation. Ciri's performance in the arena, despite the handicaps imposed by addiction and systematic abuse, demonstrated the exceptional foundation provided by her training at Kaer Morhen and her inherent capabilities that even sustained degradation could not entirely eliminate. The opponents she faced represented various categories of condemned criminals, captured prisoners of war, and other fighters whose presence in the arena resulted from circumstances ranging from judicial punishment to coerced participation motivated by desperate need or lack of alternatives. These combatants possessed varying skill levels and degrees of motivation, some fighting with determination born from hope that victory might earn release or reward, others merely attempting to survive immediate threats without clear conception of how arena combat fit into any longer trajectory of their lives. Against this range of opposition, Ciri's Witcher-trained techniques manifested in movement patterns and tactical decisions that distinguished her performances from the typically crude violence characterizing most arena fights. Bonhart observed these performances with focused attention that combined professional assessment of combat technique with sadistic pleasure in witnessing Ciri function as the instrument he had shaped through captivity and abuse. He analyzed her Witcher-trained techniques as they appeared in actual combat against opponents fighting desperately for survival, noting which elements of her training persisted despite the psychological and chemical burdens under which she operated, identifying aspects where her performance degraded or diverged from optimal execution. His growing recognition of her exceptional skill, even compromised as it was by the conditions he had imposed, appeared to satisfy curiosity about how someone bearing elder blood would manifest capabilities when subjected to systematic efforts at breaking and reshaping her into performing combatant rather than autonomous agent pursuing her own purposes. The crowd's response to the young female fighter evolved across multiple performances as regular arena attendees began recognizing her as featured attraction whose fights offered spectacle exceeding the standard brutality they had grown accustomed to witnessing. Her technical skill, the fluidity of movements that reflected training far superior to what most arena combatants demonstrated, her youth and gender creating additional dimensions to the spectacle that audiences found compelling, all contributed to her emergence as draw that increased attendance and betting volumes when word spread that she would fight on particular evenings. This audience interest served Hoovernagel's financial objectives while providing Bonhart with validation that his project of displaying his captive's capabilities had achieved recognition beyond his personal satisfaction. that others perceived value in what he had created through his systematic transformation of princess into arena combatant. Proof that his particular form of cruelty possessed artistry that could be appreciated by those sufficiently schooled in violence to recognize. Achievement even when expressed through such dark medium as forcing someone of Ciri's significance to perform for crowds gathered to watch humans injure and end one another for entertainment in that stone amphitheater, where winter winds carried sounds of combat and crowd reactions across Claremont's rooftops toward territories where other powers continued their searches for the child of destiny. Unaware that she currently existed not as prophesied figure, yet as drugged gladiator performing. Under control of captor whose purposes aligned with no faction's interests save his own. The circumstances enabling Ciri's eventual escape from Bonhart's custody remain somewhat obscure in canonical sources, the specific sequence of events and opportunities exploited receiving less detailed treatment than the captivity itself or the subsequent pursuit that followed her flight. What emerges clearly from available accounts indicates that her departure from his control occurred through combination of circumstances rather than single dramatic action, opportunity recognized and seized during moment when the normally comprehensive systems of surveillance and restraint he maintained developed temporary vulnerabilities. The escape's success likely reflected factors including the physical conditioning she had maintained despite abuse through her arena performances, accumulated knowledge of her captor's patterns and habits developed through extended observation during captivity, and perhaps assistance or at least temporary distraction provided by circumstances whose details remain unspecified in sources that focus more on outcomes than precise mechanisms. Bonhart's response to discovering Ciri's escape demonstrated the professional competence that had sustained his career across decades of hunting human quarry through hostile territories. His immediate pursuit commenced without the delays that might have given her significant head start, his tracking capabilities and understanding of probable routes allowing him to narrow search parameters efficiently even when precise direction of her flight remained initially uncertain. The methodical approach he brought to this hunt reflected neither panic nor rage at having lost valuable captive, yet rather the same calculated patience that characterized his most successful operations, recognition that sustained pressure and superior experience would eventually compensate for whatever temporary advantages her escape had created. His confidence in eventual recapture appeared justified by realistic assessment of the constraints she faced. Her fistek dependency created physiological imperatives that would influence her movements and decision-making, her lack of resources and allies in the region limited options for finding sanctuary, and the winter landscape through which she fled presented environmental challenges that favored pursuer over fugitive. The hunt across the winter landscape unfolded through territories whose populations had been reduced by warfare and whose infrastructure had deteriorated through years of inadequate maintenance and resource depletion. Snow-covered roads and fields, creating conditions that complicated travel yet also revealed tracks that skilled trackers could follow, whether serving simultaneously as obstacle and information source. Ciri's survival skills, developed through her training at Kaer Morhen and refined through subsequent experiences during her flight across the continent, enabled her to maintain movement through hostile environment despite lacking adequate supplies or preparation for extended wilderness travel during winter months. Her knowledge of herbs and basic field craft, her physical conditioning that allowed sustained exertion even under nutritional deprivation, and her developing magical abilities that occasionally manifested in moments of extreme need, all contributed to survival that exceeded what most fugitives could have achieved under similar circumstances. Other parties joined the search as intelligence about Ciri's escape and general location spread through networks that various factions maintained for tracking her movements. Stefan Skellen's Hansa, the group of mercenaries and operatives he had assembled to pursue his conspiracy's objectives, mobilized to capitalize on opportunity that her temporary separation from Bonhart presented. This band operated with resources reflecting their imperial backing, equipped adequately for winter operations and coordinated through communication systems that allowed relatively efficient coverage of territories where Ciri might seek refuge or through which she must travel to reach regions offering better prospects for evasion. Their presence complicated the pursuit by introducing multiple hunting parties whose coordination remained imperfect yet whose collective coverage reduced the spaces where Ciri might move undetected. Among Skellen's operatives pursued Rience, the mage whose scarred appearance testified to previous encounters with Ciri that had concluded disastrously for him. His motivations for participating in the hunt combined professional obligations to Skellen with personal desire for revenge against someone who had inflicted injuries whose physical evidence he carried permanently, disfigurement that served as constant reminder of humiliation and defeat. Rient's magical capabilities provided advantages in tracking and combat that mundane hunters lacked. His ability to employ spells for detection, communication across distances, and direct violence making him a particularly dangerous component of the pursuing forces. His presence among the hunters ensured that Ciri faced threats operating across multiple modalities, requiring defensive responses against both conventional armed pursuit and magical assault, further complicating escape attempts that already contended with environmental hardships and physiological withdrawal from fistek dependency. The coordination between various hunters remained imperfect despite their shared objective of capturing or eliminating Ciri, competing interests and incomplete trust between factions preventing fully integrated operations. Skellen's conspiracy required Ciri's death to disrupt Imhir's plans, yet Bonhart's purposes involved reclaiming his escaped captive for continuation of his personal project, creating potential for conflict if both parties converged on the target simultaneously. Rient's pursued objectives that combined Skellen's directives with his own agenda of personal revenge, introducing additional unpredictability regarding what would occur if he achieved contact with Ciri before other hunters. These competing purposes meant that even as multiple parties pursued the same fugitive through the same winter landscape, coordination remained tactical and temporary rather than strategic and comprehensive, each faction maintaining separate operations that occasionally intersected yet fundamentally served divergent ends. Ciri's survival skills and growing desperation manifested in tactics that exploited her pursuers' assumptions and the environmental conditions through which the hunt progressed. She moved through territories whose populations, reduced and traumatized by years of warfare, offered little assistance yet also provided minimal information to hunters seeking intelligence about her movements. Her training enabled reading of terrain that identified positions offering tactical advantages, routes that would be difficult to track, locations where temporary shelter might be found without leaving obvious traces. The desperation driving her movements emerged from understanding that recapture would return her to circumstances from which death might represent preferable alternative, that the various parties pursuing her offered no option compatible with survival on terms that preserved agency or dignity, that continued flight remained her only viable strategy even as exhaustion, withdrawal symptoms, and accumulating exposure to winter's dangers progressively undermined her physical capabilities and mental clarity. The frozen lake that would become the setting for critical confrontation represented both obstacle and opportunity in the tactical landscape through which pursuer and prey maneuvered. Large bodies of water transformed by winter into expanses of ice created terrain whose characteristics differed fundamentally from surrounding forest and field, offering open spaces where visibility extended far beyond what tree cover permitted yet also presenting surfaces whose stability varied unpredictably with ice thickness, temperature fluctuations, and underlying currents. Such environments favored those with knowledge of ice travel and willingness to exploit terrain features that more cautious parties would avoid, creating possibilities for tactics that might reverse normal advantages favoring pursuers with superior numbers and resources over isolated fugitives operating under conditions of deprivation and desperation. Possibilities that Ciri would recognize and attempt to exploit when the hunt's convergence brought multiple parties into proximity near that frozen expanse where fog rolled across ice and the sounds of cracking carried warnings about the thin boundary separating solid ground from the depths that waited beneath winter's temporary surface. The ice skates that would prove crucial to Ciri's tactics during the frozen lake confrontation had come into her possession through Visagota of Fen Khan, the hermit scholar who had provided her sanctuary during an earlier period of flight and who had preserved these relics from his deceased daughter's childhood. The skates represented more than simple equipment, carrying emotional weight as objects that connected Visagota to loss and memory, items whose provision to Ciri demonstrated trust and perhaps recognition that his daughter's possessions might serve life-preserving purposes for another young woman fleeing dangers that exceeded any reasonable person's capacity to face. The practical utility of skates in winter landscapes crossed by frozen waterways proved considerable for those possessing skill in their use, transforming ice from obstacle requiring cautious traversal into medium permitting rapid movement that walking could never match, fundamentally altering tactical calculations about pursuit and evasion when frozen surfaces featured in the terrain across which hunts progressed. Ciri's tactical use of the frozen terrain demonstrated sophisticated understanding of environmental advantages and willingness to accept risks that more cautious fugitives would reject as excessive. She recognized that the lake's expanse, particularly when fog reduced visibility to distances measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds, created conditions where her pursuer's numerical superiority became liability rather than asset. Groups moving across uncertain ice had to concern themselves with weight distribution, with the danger that multiple bodies concentrated in proximity might exceed the surface's load-bearing capacity, with the practical difficulties of maintaining formation and coordination when visibility prevented clear assessment of relative positions and threats. A single individual equipped with skates and possessing knowledge of ice conditions gained mobility advantages that could be exploited through guerrilla tactics, striking from unexpected angles before retreating into fog and distance, forcing pursuers to advance across surfaces whose stability remained uncertain while the hunted moved with speed and confidence that reflected acceptance of risks that careful analysis might recommend avoiding. The tactic of luring pursuers onto unstable ice required reading subtle indicators of surface conditions that differentiated areas capable of supporting human weight from sections where thickness had degraded through temperature variations, underlying currents, or structural stresses that created fracture zones hidden beneath deceptively solid-appearing surfaces. Ciri's training had included survival instruction covering winter operations and ice assessment, knowledge that combined with desperate necessity to inform tactical decisions about where to lead her pursuers and where to avoid venturing herself. The fog provided crucial cover for these maneuvers, obscuring her movements while simultaneously preventing skellons banned from maintaining visual contact with one another, fragmenting their coordination and creating psychological pressures that accompanied movement across ice when visibility prevented clear assessment of danger or destination. Her strikes from the fog employed classic guerrilla principles adapted to the specific conditions of combat on frozen surfaces in limited visibility. She emerged from concealment to engage isolated members of the pursuing band, her skate-enabled speed allowing approach angles and retreat vectors that footbound opponents could neither anticipate nor effectively counter. The attacks themselves reflected her Witcher training, precise strikes targeting vulnerabilities with economy that minimized exposure time before she withdrew back into obscuring mist. These sudden engagements generated psychological impact disproportionate to their immediate tactical damage, creating fear and confusion among pursuers who found themselves unable to predict when or where the next assault would materialize, uncertain whether movements toward perceived safety might actually be leading them into traps where ice would fail or attacks would arrive from directions they had not adequately defended. Skellons' band's panic and dispersal followed inevitably from accumulated pressure of repeated strikes combined with environmental dangers and visibility constraints that prevented coherent response. Professional discipline that might have maintained unit cohesion under conventional battlefield conditions proved inadequate when applied to scenario where terrain itself presented lethal threat and where their quarry had transformed from fleeing victim into active predator, exploiting every advantage that circumstances provided. The group's fragmentation, individuals, and small clusters separating as they sought safety or attempted to escape the killing ground that the frozen lake had become, represented tactical collapse that vindicated Ciri's acceptance of enormous personal risk in choosing to make her stand on this particular terrain rather than continuing flight through environments where pursuers' advantages would have manifested more conventionally. Rience's death during this encounter removed one of the more dangerous and persistent threats from among those who had pursued Ciri across multiple encounters spanning considerable time and distance. The specific circumstances of his final moments, whether he fell victim to Ciri's direct action, succumbed to the ice claiming those who ventured onto unstable sections in their panic and confusion, or met his end through some combination of factors, remained less significant than the outcome that permanently removed his magical capabilities and personal vendetta from the constellation of forces arrayed against her. His scarred face, testimony to previous confrontations' outcome, would no longer appear among those seeking her capture or elimination, one fewer mage whose spells might detect her location or assault her directly when other methods of pursuit proved insufficient. Bonhart's calculated restraint during these events, His choice to remain on shore rather than venture onto the ice in pursuit of his escaped captive revealed the pragmatic risk assessment that characterized his most successful operations. He observed the chaos unfolding on the frozen lake, watched Skellen's band fragment and panic under Ciri's guerrilla assault and the environmental dangers she had weaponized against them, and concluded that immediate pursuit would offer insufficient probability of success to justify the risks that ice and fog and a desperate opponent with significant tactical advantages would present. His expectation of capturing her again reflected confidence born from understanding that her escape from his custody, while temporarily successful, had not altered fundamental imbalances in resources, experience, and the physiological dependencies he had cultivated during her captivity. She remained a fugitive operating without allies or secure refuge, still vulnerable to the fistek withdrawal that would plague her body's demands, still pursued by multiple factions whose resources exceeded hers regardless of tactical victories she might achieve in specific encounters. The appearance of the Tower of the Swallow represented intrusion of elements beyond normal causality into a confrontation whose parameters had until that moment remained within bounds of conventional understanding, however extreme the specific circumstances. The structure manifested on the frozen lake according to principles that defied ordinary physics, responding to Ciri's desperation and her latent capabilities with elder blood that occasionally manifested in ways neither she nor those pursuing her could predict or control. The tower functioned as gateway, mechanism for transportation across boundaries separating not merely geographic locations yet entire realities, offering escape through means that no conventional pursuit could follow. Ciri's transportation to another reality occurred without conscious understanding of the mechanisms involved or control over the destination, her departure from the frozen lake driven by forces that operated beyond her volition yet which responded to her need for escape from circumstances that offered no survivable outcome through mundane means. Bonhart's shock at losing his prey to the impossible, at witnessing her departure through processes that his extensive experience provided no framework for comprehending, constituted rare moment when his control over situations encountered challenges that exceeded his capacity to respond effectively. The tower's appearance and Ciri's subsequent vanishing demonstrated that the world contained forces and possibilities that operated outside the parameters within which he had constructed his understanding of what could occur and what strategies might prove effective. His captive had escaped through means he could neither have anticipated nor prevented, disappearing into realms where his tracking skills and combat prowess offered no advantage, leaving him standing on the shore of a frozen lake where fog still obscured the ice and winter wind carried no information about where the child of destiny had gone or whether she would ever return to the reality where his hunt had seemed on the verge of achieving the recapture he had confidently expected despite the tactical setback her guerrilla assault had inflicted on those foolish enough to venture onto ice where she had established supremacy through speed, environmental knowledge, and desperate willingness to accept risks that would have paralyzed more cautious fugitives contemplating their options for survival. Vilgefortz of Roggeveen represented among the continent's magical practitioners a figure whose capabilities and ambitions placed him in categories distinct from conventional sorcerers operating within the frameworks established by institutions like the Brotherhood of Sorcerers or the Lodge of Sorceresses. His history included origins as common soldier, experiences in warfare and physical combat that preceded his later magical training, creating foundation that distinguished him from those who had pursued purely scholarly paths into sorcerous arts. This background manifested in combat style that integrated physical prowess with magical abilities, creating hybrid approach where spells supplemented rather than replaced martial techniques, making him dangerous opponent across both physical and magical dimensions simultaneously. His ambitions extended beyond the typical pursuits of influence within magical hierarchies or accumulation of wealth and political leverage that satisfied most practitioners, reaching toward objectives that touched on prophecy, elder blood lineages, and plans whose full scope suggested vision operating on timescales extending generations into possible futures. His hidden stronghold at Stigger Castle provided base for operations that required isolation from scrutiny and freedom from interference that more accessible locations would never permit. The fortress occupied position in Ebbing, one of Nilfgaard's vassal states, located on cliff overlooking a stone lake whose dark waters reflected the structure's imposing silhouette. The castle's remoteness ensured that activities conducted within its walls remained largely unknown to external observers, allowing Vilgefortz to pursue experiments and projects that would invite immediate opposition if conducted in territories where magical institutions maintained oversight or where political authorities possessed both knowledge and capacity to intervene. The physical isolation complemented magical protections and conventional defensive features, creating stronghold that could withstand assault from forces lacking both significant military capability and magical power sufficient to overcome the wards and barriers protecting the site. Within Stigger's chambers proceeded dark experiments whose nature reflected Vilgefortz's particular combination of magical expertise, absence of ethical constraints, and focus on objectives that treated individuals as resources to be utilized rather than beings possessing inherent value deserving respect. His research touched on areas that conventional magical practice either prohibited or approached with extreme caution, investigations into processes that required living subjects and methodologies that inflicted suffering as necessary component of inquiry rather than unfortunate side effect of otherwise legitimate scholarship. The experiment's purposes connected to his broader ambitions regarding elder blood and the prophesied offspring whose capabilities might reshape the continent's future according to patterns that could be influenced by those possessing sufficient knowledge, power, and willingness to manipulate bloodlines toward desired outcomes. Vilgefortz's interest in Ciri stemmed from her possession of elder blood, genetic inheritance that carried capabilities extending far beyond normal magical potential into territory where lineage itself functioned as source of power operating through mechanisms that even expert practitioners understood only partially. The prophecies surrounding Ithlin's words about elder blood and the child who would be born suggested possibilities that captured attention of anyone whose ambitions included reshaping fundamental aspects of how power manifested and who wielded it across the continent and potentially beyond. Vilgefortz had concluded that Ciri's significance lay primarily in her potential as progenitor, her value measured through the offspring she might produce if bred according to carefully planned genetic selection that would enhance and direct elder blood's capabilities towards specific outcomes that served his purposes rather than allowing prophecy to unfold through uncontrolled chance. The plan to use Ciri for breeding the prophesied offspring required maintaining her alive and physically capable of reproduction, yet necessitated no concern for her consent, comfort, or psychological well-being beyond what proved necessary to achieve the biological objectives that defined her utility within Vilgefortz's schemes. This approach treated her as vessel and genetic resource whose significance resided entirely in biological capabilities rather than as individual whose agency or suffering merited consideration. The ruthless instrumentalization reflected Vilgefortz's broader philosophical framework that recognized power as ultimate arbiter of right and that dismissed ethical concerns as constraints adopted by the weak to limit the strong, perspectives that permitted treatment of others as tools whose value derived solely from their usefulness toward achieving his objectives regardless of costs imposed on those instrumentalized within his plans. The alliance formed between Vilgefortz, Stefan Skellen, and Leo Bonhart brought together three individuals whose motivations differed yet whose interests aligned sufficiently regarding Ciri's capture and utilization to enable temporary cooperation. Vilgefortz required Ciri delivered to his stronghold for implementation of breeding plans, providing him with the elder blood lineage component necessary for producing offspring according to specifications his research had determined would maximize desired capabilities. Skellen's conspiracy benefited from arrangement that placed Ciri in Vilgefortz's control rather than Emhyr's, disrupting the Emperor's plans while simultaneously advancing schemes that served the faction seeking to undermine imperial authority through various coordinated operations. Bonhart's participation reflected calculations about payment, access to resources that Vilgefortz commanded, and perhaps curiosity about what the sorcerer intended to accomplish with a captive that Bonhart had previously possessed yet lost through circumstances involving magical transportation beyond his capacity to follow or prevent. The convergence of different motivations, magical power serving Vilgefortz's ambitions, political conspiracy driving Skellen's actions, and sadistic opportunism characterizing Bonhart's involvement, created coalition whose coherence depended on continued alignment between participants whose ultimate objectives remained fundamentally divergent. Vilgefortz sought knowledge and power derived from controlling elder blood lineage. Skellen pursued political transformation of Nilfgaard through undermining Emhyr's authority. Bonhart operated from framework of pure self-interest uncomplicated by ideology or long-term planning beyond accumulation of wealth and opportunities for exercising cruelty. These differences ensured that the alliance would persist only as long as cooperation served each party's interests more effectively than alternatives, creating a situation whose stability depended on circumstances rather than genuine shared purpose or trust between collaborators who recognized one another as potentially dangerous yet temporarily useful. Yennefer's imprisonment at Stygia represented both hostage situation and component of Vilgefort's plans that extended beyond his immediate objectives regarding Ciri. The sorceress possessed capabilities and knowledge that made her dangerous opponent if free to act, her magical prowess considerable and her dedication to Ciri's protection absolute, ensuring that any scheme involving the girl would face opposition from Yennefer if she retained freedom to intervene. Her capture and imprisonment served to neutralize that threat while simultaneously providing leverage that might prove useful if Ciri required additional motivation to cooperate with arrangements that Vilgefortz intended to impose. The conditions of her captivity reflected Vilgefort's approach to those whose opposition threatened his plans, treatment that combined physical restraint with magical binding and periodic abuse that demonstrated his power while maintaining his captive in state of controlled suffering that prevented recovery or effective planning of resistance or escape. Bonhart and Skellen's roles in the conspiracy involved functions that their particular capabilities made them suited to perform within the larger framework of Vilgefort's operation. Bonhart provided security and enforcement capabilities, his combat skills and reputation ensuring that physical threats to the stronghold would face formidable opposition, while his presence discouraged potential resistance from prisoners or others whose cooperation remained less than entirely voluntary. Skellen maintained coordination with external networks, managing intelligence gathering and communication with conspirators positioned within Nilfgaardian power structures, ensuring that developments affecting their plans received timely attention and that responses could be organized when circumstances required intervention beyond what Stygia's isolated position permitted. Together, the three formed operational center for schemes that touched on prophecy, imperial politics, and human instrumentalization, their alliance representing convergence of magical ambition, political conspiracy, and sadistic opportunism within that fortress perched above dark waters where Ciri would eventually arrive seeking to rescue Yennefer, and where confrontations would unfold determining whether the Child of Destiny would become tools serving others' purposes or whether resistance might achieve outcomes that prophecy and planning had not anticipated despite the overwhelming advantages that Vilgefort's power and preparation appeared to provide against opposition that seemed inadequate to challenge someone operating from position of such comprehensive strength within his own stronghold. Ciri's eventual arrival at Stygia Castle occurred through processes involving her transportation across realities and subsequent return to the continent, journeys whose full details encompassed experiences beyond the immediate scope of examining Bonhart's role yet whose outcome placed her within reach of those who had sought her capture across months of pursuit and planning. Her motivation for approaching Vilgefort's stronghold despite the obvious dangers stemmed from determination to rescue Yennefer, the sorceress who had served as maternal figure during crucial periods of Ciri's development and whose imprisonment represented both personal loss and injustice that demanded response regardless of strategic calculations, suggesting that direct assault on fortified position defended by one of the continent's most powerful sorcerers represented near suicidal enterprise. This willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the sake of attempting rescue demonstrated aspects of Ciri's character that training, abuse, and accumulated trauma had not eliminated, core commitments to those she loved that persisted despite everything circumstances had taught her about the costs such loyalty imposed. Warnings about the danger reached Ciri through various sources including Boreas Mun, whose prophetic capabilities provided glimpses of possible futures that attended assault on Stygia. These warnings carried weight derived from their source's reputation and the specific details they contained regarding threats that awaited within the castle's walls, emphasizing that Vilgefort's power exceeded what Ciri could hope to overcome through her own capabilities even when accounting for her elder blood potential and witcher training. The prophesied suggested outcomes ranging from capture to death, scenarios where her arrival at Stygia would serve enemies' purposes rather than achieving the rescue she intended, where her determination to save Yennefer would result in both of them remaining trapped within Vilgefort's control with no prospect of liberation or escape from whatever fates the sorcerer had determined suited his plans. Ciri's refusal to abandon her purpose despite these warnings reflected assessment that alternative courses of action offered nothing acceptable, that leaving Yennefer imprisoned while pursuing her own safety represented betrayal she could not commit regardless of survival probabilities that rational analysis would calculate. The decision to proceed towards Stygia knowing the dangers demonstrated courage that transcended simple recklessness, accepting likely consequences while maintaining commitment to attempting rescue even when success appeared improbable. This choice positioned her on trajectory toward confrontation with forces that included not merely Vilgefort's magical superiority yet also Bonhart's presence within the stronghold, bringing her back into proximity with a captor from whom she had escaped at such cost and whose interest in reclaiming her as possession remained undimmed by the time elapsed since her departure through the Tower of the Swallow. The confrontation with Vilgefortz and Bonhart that occurred following Ciri's arrival at Stygia unfolded within environment constructed specifically to maximize defenders' advantages while minimizing attackers' options for tactical maneuver or strategic surprise. The castle's architecture channeled movement through corridors and chambers whose layouts Vilgefortz knew intimately while visitors navigated blind. Magical wards detected intrusions and provided early warning of approaching threats. Defensive preparations reflected decades of planning for scenarios where the stronghold might face assault from forces seeking to disrupt operations conducted within its walls. Ciri entered this prepared killing ground driven by determination that circumstances had not provided opportunity to temper with adequate reconnaissance or tactical preparation, facing opponents whose power individually exceeded hers and whose combination represented overwhelming superiority across every dimension of capability relevant to the confrontations that would follow. The oppressive atmosphere within Stygia Castle derived from multiple sources beyond simple architectural design. Environmental factors that combined physical characteristics of ancient fortress with magical emanations from experiments conducted within its chambers and psychological weight of knowing that many who had entered these walls as prisoners had never departed except as corpses or fundamentally broken survivors of treatment that destroyed them as coherent personalities. Stone corridors carried echoes that distorted sound and prevented accurate assessment of distances or directions. Lighting remained dim and inconsistent in ways that suggested magical manipulation rather than simple absence of adequate illumination. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent pattern or source. These conditions created sensory environment that undermined confidence and tactical clarity, making navigation difficult and contributing to psychological pressure that accumulated as intruders progressed deeper into the stronghold's interior toward confrontations whose outcomes would determine whether Ciri's desperate rescue attempt achieved its objective or merely added her to the collection of captives whose fates Vilgefortz controlled absolutely within his domain. Vilgefortz's revelation of his intentions regarding Ciri's elder blood, delivered with combination of intellectual pride in his planning and complete absence of concern for her response to learning how he intended to utilize her, demonstrated the dehumanization that characterized his approach to those who possessed capabilities or characteristics he desired to exploit. He explained breeding schemes with detached thoroughness that treated discussion as educational opportunity or perhaps exercise in demonstrating superiority through sharing knowledge that his captive lacked power to act upon. His monologue revealing plans that reduced Ciri to reproductive vessel whose significance resided entirely in genetic material she could contribute toward producing offspring according to specifications that served prophesies he intended to control rather than allowing to unfold through chance or others' agency. The casual cruelty of explaining these intentions to someone who would be subjected to them reflected confidence that resistance would prove futile against the power he commanded and the preparations he had made to ensure compliance regardless of his captive's preferences or will. Bonhart's menacing presence throughout these events added physical threat dimension to the magical danger that Vilgefortz represented. His skeletal frame and flat eyes tracking Ciri's movements with attention that promised violence should she attempt resistance or display capabilities that required immediate suppression. The reunion between captor and escaped prisoner occurred within context that eliminated many of the tactical options she had employed during her previous flight. Confined spaces and controlled environment of the stronghold preventing maneuvers that had served her on frozen lake or in open territories where pursuit could be evaded through speed and environmental knowledge. Bonhart's satisfaction at having his former captive return to proximity where reclaiming her became realistic possibility manifested in expressions and posture that those present recognized as anticipation of resuming projects that her escape had interrupted. sadistic interest in discovering how her experiences during the interval had affected her psychological state and whether the dependencies he had cultivated through fistic administration persisted with sufficient strength to remain exploitable for control purposes. The imprisonment and torture of both Yennefer and Ciri that followed their reunion within Stygia's dungeons demonstrated Vilgefort's methodology for managing captives whose capabilities or significance required more sophisticated approaches than simple physical restraint could ensure. Magical binding supplemented conventional chains, spells that prevented Yennefer from accessing her considerable power while maintaining Ciri in state where elder blood capabilities remained suppressed or at minimum unreliably accessible. Physical abuse arrived with regularity designed to maintain psychological pressure and demonstrate futility of resistance. Treatment that avoided permanent damage that might compromise their utility for Vilgefort's purposes yet inflicted sufficient suffering to discourage hope and undermine whatever resolve might otherwise sustain thoughts of escape or resistance. The conditions reflected lessons learned through whatever prior experience had taught Vilgefort's optimal methods for breaking individuals who possessed both exceptional capabilities and strong wills, creating an environment where even the most determined captives gradually discovered that their determination offered no protection against the systematic application of power by someone who controlled every aspect of their existence within walls that no help would penetrate and from which no escape appeared possible through any means available to prisoners whose resources had been comprehensively suppressed through magic and violence, deployed with expertise that matched Vilgefort's considerable abilities and the complete absence of ethical constraints that might have limited how thoroughly he pursued objectives that required reducing others to instruments serving purposes they would never willingly advance if choice remained available to them. The formation of Geralt of Rivia's Hansa to rescue Ciri represented convergence of individuals whose relationships to the Witcher and to one another had developed through shared experiences during the prolonged search for the Child of Destiny across war-torn territories. The company that assembled for the assault on Stygia Castle included members whose motivations varied yet whose commitment to the rescue attempt proved sufficient to accept the extraordinary dangers that attacking Vilgefort's stronghold would entail. Milva, the archer whose skill with bow had proven invaluable during previous encounters and whose personal connection to the company had deepened through months of shared hardship and mutual dependence, brought capabilities that extended beyond simple marksmanship into tactical awareness and combat experience that made her essential component of any operation requiring coordinated action against superior forces. Emil Regis Rohelek Terzif Godefroy, the higher vampire who had adopted identity allowing interaction with humans while concealing his true nature, provided abilities that transcended normal human parameters, including regeneration from injuries that would prove fatal to others and strength that exceeded what his refined appearance suggested. Angelim, the young woman whose background in criminal enterprises had led her into association with Geralt's company through circumstances that transformed her from potential enemy into loyal companion, contributed skills developed through her previous life including proficiency with weapons, comfort with violence, and street wisdom that complemented the more formal training possessed by other company members. Cahir Ape Keelak, the former Nilfgaardian officer whose complicated relationship with Ciri had evolved from his original assignment to capture her into genuine care for her welfare and determination to protect her from dangers including those emerging from his own empire's machinations, brought military training and knowledge of Nilfgaardian tactics that proved relevant when facing opposition that included elements connected to imperial forces. Together, these individuals constituted Hansa bound by loyalty to Geralt and commitment to Ciri's rescue, understanding that the assault they contemplated offered minimal probability of success yet accepting those odds as irrelevant when measured against the alternative of abandoning someone they had sought across the continent and who now suffered imprisonment requiring response regardless of costs. Their journey towards Stygia Castle proceeded through territories where intelligence gathering and tactical preparation competed with urgency born from knowledge that delay might result in circumstances where rescue became impossible or pointless. The company moved with caution appropriate to approaching stronghold defended by powerful sorcerer and whatever forces he commanded, attempting to gather information about the castle's defenses, garrison strength, and layout while maintaining operational security that prevented Vilgefortz from learning about the approaching threat with sufficient advance warning to prepare countermeasures specifically targeting the rescue attempt. The balance between speed and discretion proved difficult to maintain, each day of travel representing time during which Ciri and Yennefer remained in Vilgefort's power, while premature exposure of the company's approach would eliminate whatever advantage surprise might provide when they finally initiated assault. Individual motivations within the company, while united in commitment to the rescue, reflected personal connections and obligations that varied between members and shaped how each understood their participation in the enterprise. For Geralt, rescuing Ciri represented fulfillment of bonds formed through destiny and deepened through years of connection despite separations imposed by circumstances beyond either's control. Obligation to child, he had accepted responsibility for protecting even when that protection required confronting dangers that exceeded normal parameters of Witcher contracts. Milva's commitment emerged from loyalty to Geralt and the company itself, relationships that had become central to her identity during their shared journey, alongside genuine affection for Ciri developed through the girl's significance to those Milva cared about. Regis's participation reflected complex motivations including intellectual curiosity about prophecy and elder blood, philosophical commitments to ideals that suffering should be opposed when opposition remained possible, and bonds formed with company members through extended association. Angolim and Cahir each brought personal connections to Ciri that transcended abstract obligation, relationships whose formation during previous encounters had created loyalties that demanded response when she faced imprisonment regardless of rational assessment of survival probabilities. The assault on Stygia Fortress commenced after whatever reconnaissance and preparation the company managed within constraints of time and available resources, their attack representing desperate gamble that superior numbers and magical power defending the castle should logically defeat, yet which they pursued through combination of tactical skill, individual capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters in Regis's case, and determination that sometimes achieved what probability suggested impossible. The battle against Vilgefort's forces unfolded through castle corridors whose architecture favored defenders and where magical wards detected intrusions while physical barriers channeled attackers into killing zones prepared specifically for repelling assaults. The company's progress through these hostile spaces required fighting through opposition that included trained soldiers, magical defenses, and eventually confrontation with Vilgefortz himself and those allied with him, including Bonhart, whose presence within the stronghold ensured that even if the company somehow overcame the sorcerer's power, additional deadly threats awaited requiring engagement before rescue could be achieved. Chaos within the castle corridors as the assault progressed created environment where tactical coherence degraded into desperate fights for survival, punctuated by brief moments of coordination, when company members managed to support one another against immediate threats before being separated again by the fortress's layout and the defenders' efforts to isolate attackers. The close quarters combat that characterized much of the fighting favored those with experience in such conditions, Geralt's Witcher training and reflexes proving invaluable, while Milva's archery found application even in confined spaces where her ability to place shots with precision at close range created advantages despite the environment limiting her weapon's normal reach superiority. Regis's capabilities manifested in ways that shocked defenders unprepared for facing opponent whose injuries regenerated and whose strength exceeded human norms, his presence forcing reallocation of defensive resources toward containing threat that conventional tactics proved inadequate to manage effectively. Milva's mortal wounding by arrow occurred during the chaotic fighting that accompanied the company's penetration deeper into Stygia's defended interior, projectile finding vulnerability despite her skill and the tactical awareness that had allowed her to survive numerous previous engagements. The wound's severity became apparent immediately. Injury that compromised her capacity to continue fighting effectively while requiring immediate attention that circumstances prevented providing adequately given the ongoing assault and the necessity of pressing forward toward objectives that required reaching Ciri and Yennefer before defenders could organize responses that would make extraction impossible even if the company somehow survived long enough to locate the prisoners. Her incapacitation removed from the company one of its most capable members, reducing their collective combat effectiveness while adding psychological burden of knowing that one among them had suffered potentially fatal injury in service of rescue attempt whose success remained far from assured despite the costs already being accumulated. Angolim's death from lance wound to the leg, injury that under normal circumstances might have been survivable though debilitating, proved fatal through combination of blood loss, shock, and the impossibility of providing adequate medical intervention during ongoing combat in hostile environment where every moment brought additional threats. Her loss further diminished the company's strength while demonstrating the terrible arithmetic of assaulting fortified position defended by superior forces, each casualty reducing their already inadequate numbers and degrading coordination that required familiar partners operating with mutual understanding developed through previous shared experiences. The mounting casualties created situation where continuing the assault forward toward rescue objectives competed with growing realization that the price being paid might ultimately exceed what even successful rescue could justify. Yet retreat remained equally impossible for company that had committed fully to enterprise and whose members would not abandon attempt, while any possibility of achieving their objective persisted regardless of costs that continued accumulating as they fought through. Stiggers defended corridors toward confrontations that would determine whether their sacrifices purchased Ciri's freedom or merely added their bodies to the casualties scattered through the fortress where Vilgefort's power and preparation had created killing ground that consumed those who dared challenge his control over captives whose significance extended far beyond their individual persons into realms of prophecy and political consequence that made their possession worth defending against any force that attempted to deny him the prizes he had secured through planning and power. The confrontation between Cahir Ait Keelak and Leo Bonhart emerged from the chaos of Stigger's assault as the company's progress through the fortress separated individuals into encounters that tactical planning could not have anticipated or prepared for adequately. Cahir, whose journey from Nilfgaardian officer assigned to capture Ciri into devoted protector willing to oppose his own empire for her sake represented one of the saga's more complex character transformations, found himself facing the bounty hunter whose reputation and demonstrated capabilities marked him as among the most dangerous unmutated humans operating across the continent. The former Black Knight's redemption arc, his gradual abandonment of loyalty to Emhyr and Nilfgaard in favor of commitment to Ciri's welfare, had brought him to this moment where abstract dedication would be tested through direct combat against opponent whose skills exceeded his own across most dimensions relevant to determining outcomes when blades met and only one combatant would survive the engagement. Cahir's complicated relationship with Ciri, formed initially through his pursuit of her under imperial orders and transformed through accumulated experiences that revealed her humanity and significance beyond the political calculations that had motivated his original assignment, provided emotional weight to his decision to stand against Bonhart despite understanding that victory remained improbable. He had witnessed her suffering from various sources during their separate and occasionally intersecting journeys, had come to recognize the injustice of treating her as object to be captured and delivered to powers that would utilize her according to schemes she had never consented to and which served interests fundamentally opposed to her welfare. His willingness to face Bonhart represented more than tactical necessity emerging from immediate circumstances, embodying broader commitment to opposing forces that had systematically victimized Ciri across months and years when she had been pursued, captured, abused, and treated as commodity whose value resided in her utility to others rather than in her inherent worth as individual deserving protection and agency. The duel between Cahir and the bounty hunter unfolded with brutal clarity about the gap separating competent military training from the exceptional skill that Bonhart had refined through decades of survival in profession, where inadequacy meant death and excellence translated directly into longevity. Cahir brought to the engagement training received through Nilfgaardian military academies, experience gained through campaigns and personal combat, courage sufficient to face superior opponent without paralysis or retreat. These advantages proved inadequate against Bonhart's technique, the elderly hunter's blade work demonstrating precision and tactical awareness that systematically dismantled Cahir's defenses while creating openings that his attacks exploited with efficiency that wasted no motion on unnecessary flourishes or complex maneuvers when simple solutions sufficed to achieve lethal outcomes. Bonhart's superior skill in swordsmanship manifested through exchanges that progressively degraded Cahir's position and eroded whatever hope had sustained his engagement beyond the point where dispassionate analysis would have recommended surrender or flight. Each clash of blades revealed timing advantages that Bonhart converted into spatial dominance, footwork that positioned him optimally while forcing Cahir into reactive postures that prevented offensive initiative, strikes that accumulated damage through precision targeting of areas where armor provided insufficient protection or where previous wounds had created vulnerabilities. The accumulated effect of these tactical advantages meant that the duel's outcome had been determined well before its actual conclusion. Bonhart's control over the engagement's progression, allowing him to extend or abbreviate the fight according to his preferences rather than according to anything Cahir's resistance might have influenced through greater effort or determination. Cahir's courage, despite knowing he faced an opponent whose capabilities exceeded his, remained evident throughout the duel, his continued engagement reflecting commitment to purpose that transcended self-preservation or rational calculation of survival probabilities. He understood that defeating Bonhart through direct combat remained beyond his capabilities, that the most likely outcome involved his own death without achieving meaningful damage against opponent who moved through their exchanges with confidence born from accurate assessment of relative skill levels. This knowledge did not produce surrender or attempts to negotiate terms that might have preserved his life at the cost of abandoning the rescue attempt that had brought him to Stygia. Instead, he fought with determination that honored the bonds formed through his journey with Geralt's company and his commitment to Ciri's protection, accepting death as acceptable price for even marginal contribution to efforts that might achieve her rescue from captivity and abuse that her imprisonment within Vilgefort's stronghold represented. The fatal wounds inflicted by Bonhart arrived through sequence of strikes that followed inexorable logic of superior technique overcoming inadequate defense, his blade finding openings that Cahir's positioning and reflexes could not adequately cover, penetrating to depths that produced injuries incompatible with continued function or survival. The specific details of these final moments, the particular wounds that ended Cahir's resistance and life, demonstrated Bonhart's thorough understanding of human anatomy and the precise locations where steel needed to penetrate to achieve swift incapacitation. His technique throughout the engagement, including its terminal phase, revealed the same cold efficiency that characterized all his combat performances: violence delivered without emotional content or excessive force. Merely sufficient application of skill to achieve objectives with minimal expenditure of effort or exposure to counterattack risks that less controlled fighters might have accepted through anger or satisfaction at dominating overmatched opponent. Cahir's death, as witnessed by Ciri, occurred within her field of awareness during moments when the assault's chaos had brought her into proximity to the duel's conclusion. Her observation of another protector falling to Bonhart's blade adding fresh trauma to psychological burdens already accumulated through captivity, and the knowledge that people she cared for were sacrificing themselves in attempts to rescue her from circumstances that seemed to generate escalating costs without corresponding progress toward liberation. The emotional impact manifested through grief complicated by guilt, awareness that Cahir had died specifically because of his commitment to her welfare, that the rescue attempt had transformed from abstract plan into concrete reality measured in bodies of companions who had accepted mortal danger for her sake. The loss of someone whose relationship to her had evolved from antagonist to protector, whose transformation demonstrated possibility of redemption and change even within systems and hierarchies designed to suppress individual moral agency in favor of institutional loyalty, struck particularly deep given the complicated history between them and the genuine affection that had developed despite the inauspicious circumstances of their initial encounters. Angeline's prior death, also at Bonhart's hands, meant that the bounty hunter had personally accounted for multiple members of Geralt's company during the assault on Stygia, his combat effectiveness translating into casualty rate that significantly degraded the rescue attempt's already marginal prospects for success. Each companion who fell reduced the collective capability available for overcoming remaining obstacles between Ciri and freedom, eliminating individuals whose specific skills and combat contributions had been essential components of tactical planning such as it was. The mounting casualties created situation where the psychological burden of witnessing friends and protectors suffer fatal injuries competed with the practical necessity of continuing forward despite losses, forcing Ciri to process grief while circumstances demanded continued function and engagement with immediate threats that permitted no time for adequate emotional response to trauma being accumulated through watching people die in service of attempting to rescue her from captivity whose horrors they might not have fully comprehended yet, which they opposed through actions that demonstrated commitment exceeding what words alone could convey about the bonds that had formed within Geralt's Hansa during their journey across the continent toward this fortress where prophecy and power converged in ways that demanded resistance regardless of costs that continued escalating with each life claimed by defenders who recognized that allowing Ciri's rescue would frustrate plans whose significance extended far beyond individual lives or immediate tactical outcomes. Ciri's isolation after losing her companions to the assault's escalating casualties created psychological state where grief and rage competed with exhaustion and the accumulated trauma of captivity, arena performances, escape, recapture, and now witnessing those who had come to rescue her falling to defenders whose capabilities had proven superior to what the company's planning and courage could overcome. The progression through Stygia's corridors had separated surviving members of Geralt's Hansa, architectural features, and tactical necessities fragmenting their coordination until Ciri found herself advancing alone through spaces where echoes carried sounds of ongoing combat yet provided no reliable information about her companions' locations or status. The isolation amplified every aspect of her experience, removing the psychological support that shared danger sometimes provides while intensifying awareness that her next confrontation would occur without assistance from others whose presence might have altered tactical calculations or at minimum provided companionship during moments that tested the limits of what individual courage could sustain. Confronting Bonhart alone represented a scenario that combined immediate tactical danger with symbolic significance that transcended the specific combat encounter, bringing her face to face with a captor whose systematic abuse had shaped her psychological landscape during months when she had existed as his possession rather than autonomous agent. The bounty hunter whose skeletal frame and flat eyes had haunted her thoughts during captivity and flight, whose methods of control through violence and addiction had demonstrated human capacity for cruelty that required no supernatural enhancement to achieve depths of depravity exceeding what most monsters inflicted on their prey, now stood between her and whatever remained of the rescue attempt that had brought Geralt's company into Vilgefort's fortress. The confrontation's inevitability had perhaps been building since her initial escape from his custody, each subsequent event creating circumstances that drew them toward this meeting where accounts would be settled through direct engagement rather than through continued flight and pursuit across territories that had provided only temporary respite from the hunt. Bonhart's satisfaction at this outcome manifested in expressions and posture that Ciri recognized from captivity, indicators that he experienced pleasure at having engineered or at minimum arrived at situation that aligned with preferences he had maintained throughout their previous interactions. He had desired extended opportunity to test her capabilities in combat without the constraints that arena performances imposed, where Fistekker's effects and the artificial limitations of staged fights prevented full expression of what her training and elder blood might achieve when she fought without chemical compromise and with genuine motivation deriving from accumulated rage rather than drug-induced dissociation. The duel represented culmination of his curiosity about her potential, opportunity to discover whether the child of destiny could function as warrior capable of challenging someone of his caliber when circumstances removed the systematic disadvantages he had imposed during her captivity and replaced them with stakes that might elevate her performance beyond what prior observations had revealed. The psychological states of both combatants as they prepared to engage reflected fundamentally different relationships to the impending violence and what it represented within their respective understandings of purpose and identity. For Bonhart, the duel offered intellectual satisfaction alongside the sadistic pleasure he derived from dominating and potentially ending someone whose significance extended beyond normal parameters, his emotional state characterized by anticipation uncomplicated by doubt or fear, confidence born from accurate assessment of his capabilities and realistic evaluation of how Ciri's improvements during the months since her escape compared to the vast experience advantage he maintained. His approach to the confrontation proceeded from frameworks that treated combat as craft to be executed with precision, violence as tool serving purposes rather than as expression of emotional states that might compromise technical performance through anger or satisfaction that disrupted concentration. Ciri's grief transmuting into determination created psychological foundation that differed qualitatively from the state she had occupied during previous fights, her emotional investment in this particular combat deriving from accumulated losses and witness suffering rather than from abstract principles or survival imperatives alone. She faced not merely dangerous opponent whose defeat would remove obstacle to continued progress through Stygia's corridors, yet the architect of specific traumas that had marked her permanently, the individual who had transformed her from fugitive princess into captive forced to perform in arenas while drugged and abused, whose actions had ended the rats and preserved missiles' remains as instruments of psychological torture. The rage fueling her engagement carried weight that training alone could never generate, emotional intensity that sometimes elevated performance beyond what technical skill alone achieved, though it equally risked compromising the tactical discipline that effective combat required. Bonhart's confidence and sadistic anticipation merged into unified orientation toward the duel that reflected decades of experience facing opponents whose capabilities ranged from negligible to exceptional. His accumulated victories providing foundation for expectations that this encounter would follow patterns established through previous confrontations, where his superiority eventually manifested regardless of initial uncertainty about outcomes. He had faced witches according to his claims and possessed their medallions as evidence supporting those assertions, had survived countless engagements against skilled fighters whose deaths testified to his consistent ability to prevail when blades crossed, and only technical excellence determined who would continue living. That Ciri possessed witcher training and elder blood heritage distinguished her from most opponents, yet did not fundamentally alter his assessment that experience and refined technique would prove decisive when their engagement progressed past initial exchanges into sustained combat, where stamina, tactical awareness, and the subtle advantages accumulated through lifetime of relevant practice manifested their cumulative effects. The arena of their final confrontation within Stygia consisted of stone chamber whose dimensions provided adequate space for meaningful combat, yet remained confined enough that neither party could employ purely evasive strategies indefinitely, architecture that would force engagement rather than allowing tactical stalemate through mutual avoidance. The setting's characteristics favored neither combatant particularly. Neutral ground where environmental advantages would emerge through superior positioning and tactical awareness rather than through familiarity or prepared advantages that one party possessed and the other lacked. The aftermath of the castle assault provided backdrop for their private duel, sounds of ongoing combat elsewhere creating ambient noise that emphasized their isolation, while bodies of friends nearby served as visual reminders of costs already paid and stakes that extended beyond the immediate tactical question of who would survive the encounter. Zira L rested in Ciri's hands. The sword Bonhart had commissioned for her from Esterhazy's collection now serving as weapon she would employ against the one who had provided it. Symbolic reversal that transformed object intended to enable arena performances into instrument through which she would attempt to reclaim agency and exact retribution for treatment that had reduced her to performing possession. The blade's quality, the gnomic craftsmanship and 200-year legacy of superior metallurgy and construction, meant that equipment disparity would not determine the duel's outcome, both combatants wielding weapons adequate to their skill levels and the demands that serious combat imposed on steel that must maintain edge and integrity through sustained contact with opposing blades and armor. The swallow blade, named during captivity in small assertion of identity maintenance against systematic efforts to reduce her to instruments serving others' purposes, would now be tested in combat whose significance extended far beyond technical demonstration of swordsmanship into territory where personal histories and psychological dimensions amplified every tactical decision and physical exchange, where the next minutes would determine whether Bonhart's confidence proved justified or whether the combination of Ciri's improvement since escape, her emotional investment in this particular fight, and whatever advantages destiny or chance might provide could overcome the vast gulf separating competent training from mastery refined across decades of survival in profession that tolerated no persistent inadequacy and rewarded excellence with continued existence and accumulating reputation as someone whose presence on battlefields or in personal combats shifted probability toward outcomes that served his purposes regardless of opposition's initial advantages or determination to achieve different results. The beginning of the one-on-one combat commenced with initial exchanges that established rhythm and provided both combatants opportunity to assess how their opponent approached the engagement, probing attacks and defensive responses that revealed preferred ranges, reflexive patterns, and the general framework within which each fighter operated. Bonhart opened with techniques designed to test Ciri's current capabilities and determine how her skills had developed or degraded during the months since their last direct confrontation, his blade moving through sequences that required specific defensive responses whose execution would indicate whether her training remained sharp or had suffered erosion through the various traumas and interruptions that had characterized her recent experiences. His initial assessment likely confirmed that she retained technical competence, that the Witcher training from Kaer Morhen persisted as foundational framework informing her movements and tactical decisions, yet also revealed aspects where sustained practice under proper instruction had been impossible. Subtle degradations in form or timing that distinguished fighters maintaining regular training from those whose skills had been preserved through necessity and irregular application rather than systematic refinement. Bonhart's masterful technique displayed itself fully during the engagement, his movements flowing with economy that eliminated wasted motion while maintaining defensive integrity that prevented Ciri from exploiting momentary openings that less experienced fighters might have mistaken for genuine vulnerabilities. Each strike arrived along optimal paths that forced her into reactive responses rather than allowing her to establish offensive initiative, his footwork creating angles that positioned him advantageously while limiting her options for effective counterattack. The blade work demonstrated sophistication that came only through decades of refinement, techniques whose execution appeared simple yet incorporated countless subtle adjustments that ordinary observation might miss entirely, though their cumulative effect proved devastating to opponents whose own skills, while considerable, had not been honed to equivalent levels through similar investment of time and focused practice. His control over the engagement's tempo allowed him to dictate when exchanges accelerated into flurries of rapid strikes and blocks, when they slowed into more measured exchanges where positioning mattered more than speed, when brief pauses occurred that provided opportunities to reassess and adjust tactics according to developing patterns. Ciri's Witcher training received its most severe test during this duel. Every lesson learned at Kaer Morhen under instruction from Vesemir, Lambert, Eskel, Cohen, and Geralt himself becoming relevant as she struggled to maintain defensive coherence against opponent whose capabilities exceeded those of any training partner she had faced during her education. The forms she had practiced countless times through repetition, designed to embed them into muscle memory, manifested now under conditions where errors produced immediate consequences, where theoretical understanding of proper technique confronted reality of executing those techniques against someone whose counters arrived faster than conscious thought could process and required trained reflexes operating below conscious awareness to have any hope of adequate response. Her footwork, the positioning and distance management that Witcher combat instruction emphasized as foundational to survival, faced continuous testing as Bonhart's pressure forced her through spaces where maintaining optimal range became progressively more difficult, where the chamber's dimensions and her own fatigue gradually constrained movement options. The grueling nature of the fight manifested through accumulating exhaustion and wounds that degraded both combatants' performance, though Bonhart's superior conditioning and experience allowed him to maintain higher levels of effectiveness despite the physical demands that extended combat imposed. Ciri's breathing grew labored as sustained exertion depleted energy reserves, her muscles accumulating fatigue that slowed movements incrementally yet significantly when measured against opponent whose timing operated at levels where fractions of seconds determined whether strikes landed or missed. Wounds opened by Bonhart's blade where her defense proved inadequate, cuts that individually might not have threatened immediate incapacitation yet collectively represented blood loss and pain that further compromised her capability. The psychological dimension of fighting through exhaustion and injury added layers of difficulty beyond the purely physical challenges, requiring maintenance of concentration and tactical awareness when instincts urged retreat or surrender that circumstances did not permit. Bonhart's surprise at her resilience emerged gradually as the duel extended beyond durations where most opponents had already fallen or been reduced to purely defensive postures that merely delayed inevitable conclusions. His initial confidence, justified by realistic assessment of skill differentials and his extensive experience predicting how fights would progress based on early exchanges, encountered reality that Ciri's determination and the specific emotional investment driving her engagement produced performance that exceeded what her technical capabilities alone would have generated. The Witcher training combined with her inherent potential and the rage fueling her resistance created opponent who, while still inferior to him in most dimensions of combat competence, proved more difficult to definitively overcome than his experience suggested someone of her approximate skill level should have been. This surprise likely manifested subtly in his expressions and tactical adjustments, recognition that straightforward application of superior technique might require more time or effort than he had initially calculated, that the duel's conclusion remained certain yet its timing less predictable than encounters with opponents whose motivations derived from simple survival imperatives rather than from accumulated personal history and witnessed suffering. Ciri's application of lessons learned from Kaer Morhen training became particularly evident when she began employing techniques specifically designed to counter opponents with superior reach, strength, or speed advantages, methods that witches had developed through centuries of facing threats whose physical capabilities exceeded unmodified human parameters. The pendulum technique, which utilized momentum against opponents by transforming defensive movements into foundations for counterattacks that borrowed energy from avoided strikes, appeared in her tactical repertoire as the fight progressed and she adapted to Bonhart's patterns. Reference to Geralt's teachings about countering superior force through timing and precision rather than through matching power directly informed choices about when to yield ground that could be recovered strategically rather than defending positions whose maintenance would cost more than their value justified, when to accept hits to non-vital areas in exchange for creating openings that might permit strikes toward more significant targets. The gradual shift in the duel's momentum occurred through accumulated small advantages that Ciri managed to create despite Bonhart's superior skill. Moments where her adaptations to his style began yielding marginal improvements in her defensive success rate and corresponding increases in opportunities for offensive actions that forced him into responses rather than allowing him to maintain complete tactical initiative. Her growing familiarity with his preferred sequences and timing allowed anticipation that reduced reaction requirements, enabling her to position preemptively rather than purely reactively, creating foundations for tactical exchanges where she could attempt to impose her will rather than merely responding to his direction. The improvements remained insufficient to reverse the fundamental skill differential yet proved enough to extend the fight beyond what Bonhart's early dominance had suggested, transforming what had appeared to be foregone conclusion approaching rapidly into more uncertain engagement where outcome remained probable yet not absolutely guaranteed within timeframes he had expected. The moment she identified his pattern and vulnerability arrived through synthesis of observations accumulated across the duel's duration, recognition that even mastery contained habits and preferences that could be identified and potentially exploited by opponents sufficiently skilled and determined to sustain engagement long enough for patterns to become apparent. Bonhart's technique, while exceptional, followed frameworks developed through decades of successful application, methods that had proven effective across countless encounters and which consequently had become ingrained through repetition into responses he executed with minimal conscious thought. This consistency, normally an advantage that allowed execution at speeds conscious decision-making could never match, created predictability for opponents who survived long enough to observe multiple iterations of his tactical sequences and possessed sufficient understanding of swordsmanship to recognize what they witnessed and formulate responses that accounted for identified patterns. Ciri's Witcher training provided foundation for this analytical approach to combat, her instructors having emphasized that defeating superior opponents required observation and adaptation rather than simple application of technique in rigid adherence to forms, that intelligence and tactical flexibility sometimes compensated for physical disadvantages or skill gaps when maintained through circumstances that tested every aspect of combatant's capabilities and determination to prevail despite facing opposition that probability suggested should prove insurmountable. Ciri's decisive action ending the duel emerged from convergence of factors that included the tactical vulnerability she had identified through sustained observation, the moment of exhaustion or overconfidence when Bonhart's normally impeccable defense developed brief opening, and her own willingness to accept risk of committing fully to strike that would either end the engagement or expose her to counterattack that might prove fatal. The specific sequence of movements that created this opportunity and how she exploited it reflected Witcher training's emphasis on recognizing and acting upon momentary advantages with speed and precision that ordinary combatants might hesitate to attempt, understanding that fights against superior opponents were won through capitalizing on brief windows rather than through sustained application of technique that time would favor the more skilled fighter. Her blade moved through arc that Bonhart's positioning had left marginally less defended than other approaches, Ciri's gnomic forged steel finding the gap in his defense that his pattern and her adaptation had created, the sword's quality ensuring that it maintained integrity and cutting capacity through the impact that followed. Bonhart's death by Ciri carried multiple dimensions of significance that extended beyond the tactical outcome of one combatant prevailing over another in armed combat. The sword he had commissioned specifically for her, selected from Esterhazy's collection with attention to quality and characteristics that would serve the purposes he had envisioned for his captive's arena performances, now became instrument of his own end. The blade that was meant to demonstrate his dominance and showcase her performances under his control instead serving to terminate his existence and end the threat he represented. The irony inherent in this reversal, dying by weapon he had provided, reflected broader themes about control and agency, about how attempts to reduce others to instruments serving one's purposes sometimes generated forces that escaped intended constraints and turned back upon those who had sought to be masters of situations whose complexity exceeded their frameworks for understanding and management. His final moments, the period between receiving mortal wound and the cessation of consciousness that death brings, remained largely unrecorded in specific detail within canonical sources, though Bonhart's character suggests responses that aligned with the cold pragmatism and emotional detachment that had characterized his approach to existence throughout documented encounters. Any last attempts at manipulation, whether through words seeking to instill doubt or final efforts to inflict psychological damage even as physical capacity failed, would have reflected the sadistic orientation that had defined his interactions with victims across his career. The absence of fear or regret in facing death seems consistent with nihilistic worldview that recognized no meaning beyond immediate experience, no judgment awaiting after consciousness ended, merely the termination of awareness and sensation that life represented. Transition from existence to non-existence that held no particular significance within frameworks stripped of spiritual or moral dimensions that might have created different responses to mortality's approach. The canonical description of his death, presented without embellishment or dramatic elaboration, emphasized finality and the straightforward physical reality of life ending when critical injuries exceeded the body's capacity to maintain function. The sparse treatment reflected approach to violence that characterized the saga's presentation more broadly, attention to consequences and costs rather than glorification or extended focus on suffering and death as spectacles. Bonhart's end came through combination of factors including Ciri's skill, his own patterns creating exploitable vulnerability, and the accumulated exhaustion that extended combat imposed even on someone whose conditioning exceeded normal parameters. The simplicity of the description contrasted with the complexity of events that had led to this conclusion, years of pursuit and abuse and escape and pursuit again culminating in moments where steel opened flesh and severed connections maintaining consciousness, reducing figure who had inspired terror across territories and shaped lives through systematic cruelty into corpse whose presence would no longer threaten or harm. Ciri's emotional state following the stroke that ended Bonhart's life encompassed exhaustion and relief rather than triumph, the conclusion of combat against her captor and tormentor producing responses that reflected costs already paid rather than satisfaction at victory achieved. The duel had demanded everything she possessed physically and psychologically, pushing her to limits where continued function became questionable and where survival emerged more through desperation and adaptation than through comfortable margins suggesting that outcome had been assured. Relief came from recognition that immediate threat had ended, that Bonhart would never again inflict the systematic abuse that had characterized her captivity, that his hunt for her had concluded permanently through his death rather than through scenarios where he might have continued pursuing her across whatever time remained to him. The absence of triumph reflected understanding that his death, while necessary and just, restored nothing that he had taken, returned no one he had ended, healed no trauma he had inflicted during months when she had existed as his possession rather than autonomous individual. The taking of the 3 Witcher medallions from his corpse represented reclamation of tokens whose significance extended beyond their material value or even their symbolic associations with schools and traditions they represented. These medallions, worn by Bonhart as trophies and proof of claimed victories over witches, had served psychological warfare purposes through intimidation and had embodied his dominance over category of warriors whose legendary status made defeating them remarkable achievement if his claims held truth or particularly audacious lie if he had acquired them through less honorable means. Removing them from his body transferred possession while simultaneously ending their function as instruments of fear, transforming them from active components of his threatening presence into objects whose meaning would be redefined through their subsequent distribution and use by those who held different relationships to Witcher traditions and who would invest them with significance derived from contexts beyond Bonhart's violent career. The distribution of medallions following their recovery assigned each to recipient whose relationship to Witcher traditions or personal history made possession meaningful, creating new associations that overlaid or replaced whatever significance they had carried while hanging around Bonhart's skeletal neck. The Cat School medallion remained with Ciri, connection to traditions and training that had shaped crucial aspects of her identity and capabilities, despite her never completing full Witcher transformation through the mutations that would have made her member of that brotherhood in technical sense. The wolf medallion would eventually reach Geralt, returning symbol of his school to someone whose embodiment of Witcher ideals and dedication to protecting Ciri had driven the rescue attempt that created circumstances allowing Bonhart's defeat. The Griffin medallion found placement with Yennefer, whose magical expertise and long association with Witcher communities made her appropriate guardian for token representing school that emphasized signs and magical theory alongside martial training. These distributions created a network of connections between significant figures, physical objects serving as reminders of events at Stygia and broader histories that had brought them to that fortress where prophecy and power and personal loyalty converged in ways that demanded resistance regardless of odds. The symbolic reclamation of Witcher honor through recovering medallions from someone who had displayed them as trophies suggested restoration of dignity to traditions and individuals whose deaths or defeats had enabled Bonhart's acquisition of these tokens. Whether he had truly defeated 3 Witchers in honorable combat or obtained medallions through less legitimate means remained unresolved, though his demonstrated capabilities made either explanation plausible within bounds of what canonical sources established about his skills and methods. Regardless of acquisition circumstances, their removal from his possession and redistribution to those who would treat them with respect rather than as instruments of intimidation represented correction of injustice. Small restoration that acknowledged wrongs committed while recognizing that recovery of objects could not resurrect the dead or undo trauma inflicted during the years when Bonhart had operated across the continent, leaving trails of casualties and psychological damage whose effects would persist long after his body grew cold in Stygia's stone chambers, where winter winds carried sounds of combat winding down as the assault's surviving participants discovered outcomes of confrontations that had scattered them through the fortress toward encounters whose resolutions would determine whether the rescue attempt achieved its objective sufficiently to justify the terrible prices already paid in lives of companions who had ventured into Vilgefort's stronghold, knowing that survival remained improbable, yet maintaining commitments that transcended self-preservation when balanced against purposes that demanded action regardless of costs or probability of success. The reflection on Bonhart's impact on those who survived him necessarily begins with Cirilla herself, whose experiences during captivity and subsequent encounters had shaped her psychological development in ways that would persist throughout her remaining life regardless of whatever healing time and distance might eventually provide. The trauma from captivity extended beyond simple memories of physical abuse into more complex territories where systematic degradation and chemical dependency had altered her relationship to her own body and capabilities, creating associations between combat performance and Fistek-induced association that complicated her ability to integrate experiences into coherent narrative understanding. The arena performances, conducted under conditions where euphoria and violence intertwined through pharmacological manipulation, had generated memories whose emotional content remained difficult to process. Where acts she had committed existed in psychological spaces disconnected from moral frameworks that would normally have structured responses to having ended other humans' existence, even when those endings occurred in contexts of forced combat for survival. The death of Missile and the destruction of the rats represented losses that carried weight beyond the immediate grief of witnessing friends ended through Bonhart's methodical assault on the gang. These individuals had provided surrogate family during period when Ciri's displacement from all previous sources of belonging and identity had left her psychologically vulnerable to the particular forms of damage that isolation and purposelessness inflict on those who lack stable connections to communities or relationships that might anchor sense of self. Their elimination removed that anchor while simultaneously demonstrating her inability to protect those she cared about from dangers that her significance attracted, creating guilt patterns where she internalized responsibility for bringing threats that ultimately destroyed people whose only connection to imperial conspiracies, prophetic schemes, and elder blood politics came through their association with her. The preserved remains that Bonhart had maintained and displayed during her captivity ensured that grief remained fresh rather than healing through normal processes, physical evidence of destruction preventing the gradual acceptance and integration that time facilitates when memories alone carry loss rather than tangible reminders, forcing constant confrontation with trauma sources. How Bonhart's cruelty shaped Ciri's psychological development manifested in multiple dimensions, including her relationship to violence, her capacity for trust, and her understanding of human nature's darker possibilities. Someone who had been systematically abused by captor whose sadism represented carefully cultivated expertise rather than simple opportunistic brutality, learned lessons about what humans could become when constraints eroded and power over others enabled indulgence of impulses that civilized society nominally condemned, yet which war and social breakdown revealed existed latently within populations whose moral frameworks proved more fragile than comfortable assumptions about human decency suggested. The recognition that someone could derive genuine pleasure from inflicting suffering, that cruelty could be approached as craft requiring study and refinement, that another person's pain could constitute entertainment rather than tragedy, these understandings altered her perception of the world and the threats it contained in ways that exceeded the specific danger Bonhart individually had represented. Expanding awareness of what might be encountered when circumstances placed her in proximity to others whose psychological profiles shared characteristics with her former captor. The broader question of evil in the Witcher world, as illuminated through Bonhart's character and actions, touched on themes that the saga explored through multiple figures whose moral status defied simple categorization. The continent's complex ethical landscape featured individuals and institutions whose behaviors ranged across spectrums from admirable to monstrous, with most occupying ambiguous territories where judgment depended on perspective and which principles one prioritized when evaluating actions that produced both harms and benefits depending on whose interests one centered in analysis. Bonhart occupied position near the extreme end of this spectrum, figure whose actions appeared irredeemable from virtually any ethical framework that granted intrinsic value to human well-being or recognized obligations to minimize suffering when alternative approaches to achieving objectives existed. His characterization as embodiment of human monstrosity without supernatural element, absent mutations or magical corruption that might explain or partially excuse his nature through reference to external forces that had transformed him against his will, emphasized that the evil he represented emerged from purely human sources, capacities that existed within the species' behavioral repertoire without requiring demonic influence or inhuman contamination. The observation that Bonhart possessed no mutations, no magical enhancements, merely exceptional skill developed through natural talents and intensive training combined with complete absence of ethical constraints, positioned him as counterpoint to the enhanced monsters that witches typically hunted and destroyed. Where creatures like griffins, leshens, or vampires possessed capabilities that exceeded human parameters through biological characteristics of their species, Bonhart achieved comparable danger levels through pure human potential maximized and directed entirely toward harmful purposes. His existence posed questions about whether humanity's capacity for cultivating excellence applied equally across domains regardless of moral content, whether the same dedication and systematic approach that produced masters in beneficial arts could generate equivalent mastery in cruelty when someone possessed psychological orientation that found satisfaction in causing suffering and lacked internalized prohibitions that might have diverted those energies toward less destructive applications. The implications suggested that monstrosity as category extended beyond biological characteristics into behavioral patterns, that humans could achieve functional equivalence to creatures typically classified as monsters through choices and cultivation rather than through the accidents of species membership. His place in the gallery of Witcher antagonists included figures whose evil manifested through different modalities, from Vilgefort's magical ambition and willingness to instrumentalize others toward mystical objectives, to political conspirators whose schemes sacrificed individuals to abstract principles about governance and power, to creatures acting according to nature rather than moral frameworks humans might apply to evaluate their predation. Among these varied threats, Bonhart distinguished himself through his particular combination of exceptional capability and pure sadism, absence of motivations that might have provided even minimal justification or comprehensibility to his actions beyond the satisfaction they provided him personally. Where Vilgefortz pursued knowledge and power that at least possessed coherent objectives even if methods proved monstrous, where political conspirators claimed to serve ideals about justice or proper governance even if their actual conduct contradicted those claimed principles, Bonhart operated without even pretense of serving purposes beyond his immediate gratification, making him perhaps more purely evil than antagonists whose complexity included elements that mitigated or contextually explained their harmful actions. The comparison to monsters Geralt hunted, creatures whose predation on humans derived from biological imperatives or territorial instincts rather than from malice or sadism, revealed uncomfortable truth that sometimes human evil exceeded the bestial in ways that inverted common assumptions about what constituted greatest threats to civilization and individual welfare. A griffin that attacked travelers did so according to nature, responding to hunger or defending territory, operating within frameworks where moral evaluation seemed inappropriate given the creature's lack of capacity for ethical reasoning or choice about whether to act differently than instinct directed. Bonhart possessed all the cognitive capabilities that enabled moral reasoning, understood the suffering he inflicted, recognized alternatives to cruelty that could have achieved practical objectives without the systematic abuse that characterized his methods, yet chose approaches that maximized pain and degradation because those outcomes aligned with his preferences rather than because necessity demanded them. This distinction made his evil qualitatively different from bestial threat, positioning human monstrosity as potentially exceeding supernatural or animal dangers when measured by standards that accounted for capacity for different choices and deliberate selection of harmful approaches over available alternatives. The medallions as lasting reminder of Bonhart's existence functioned beyond their immediate utility as Witcher artifacts, serving as physical connections to histories that included his violence and the resistance that eventually ended his career. Each time Ciri touched the cat medallion, each occasion when Geralt encountered the wolf token that had somehow ended in Bonhart's possession, each moment when Yennefer observed the griffin symbol, these interactions carried associations with a bounty hunter whose death had returned the medallions to circulation among those who would honor rather than defile what they represented. The objects persisted as memory anchors that prevented complete forgetting even when time began eroding the sharp clarity of events at Stygia, ensuring that Bonhart's impact continued through material culture that outlasted his physical existence and carried his story into contexts where direct experience of his cruelty could not reach yet where knowledge of what he had represented maintained relevance to ongoing struggles about power, suffering, and resistance to forces that treated individuals as objects lacking inherent worth deserving protection. Questions left unanswered regarding the truth about the three witches whose medallions Bonhart had worn remained unresolved in canonical sources, ambiguity that perhaps served the narrative's broader purposes by maintaining mystery about aspects of his history that complete exposition might have diminished. Whether he had truly defeated three witches in honorable single combat, achievement that would represent extraordinary feat even for someone of his demonstrated capabilities, or whether he had obtained medallions through treachery, ambush, or acquisition from corpses whose deaths he had no role in causing, shaped assessment of his claims and reputation in ways that affected but did not fundamentally alter the evil his documented actions demonstrated. The uncertainty allowed observers to draw conclusions aligned with their prior assumptions about what seemed plausible given his skills and character, some concluding that his capabilities justified belief in the claims while others maintained skepticism born from understanding that reputation often exceeded reality and that someone willing to lie through actions would face minimal barriers to lying through claims about achievements that convenient lack of witnesses prevented verification of. Through independent testimony from those whose deaths ensured silence about circumstances that only Bonhart's version could present to those curious about how he had acquired trophies that served his purposes regardless of acquisition's actual circumstances. The philosophical examination of Bonhart's character within the saga's themes requires situating him against the broader moral landscape that Andrzej Sapkowski constructed throughout the Witcher cycle. A universe whose ethical complexity resisted simple categorizations, and whose inhabitants operated within frameworks where conventional distinctions between good and evil frequently collapsed under pressure of circumstances that demanded choices among options offering no clearly righteous path. The saga's exploration of monstrosity extended far beyond biological classifications distinguishing humans from other sentient species or from creatures operating primarily through instinct, penetrating into territories where the concept encompassed behavioral patterns and moral orientations that could manifest regardless of species membership or physical characteristics. Sapkowski's world presented monstrosity as quality potentially inhabiting any being capable of choice, distributed across categories that surface analysis might consider categorically distinct, revealing through accumulated examples that the capacity for monstrous action transcended biological determinants and resided instead in selections individuals made about how to exercise whatever power circumstances granted them over others. The lesser evil debates that recurred throughout the saga as philosophical through line, most explicitly articulated during the short story bearing that title yet resonating across multiple narrative arcs, concerned questions about moral calculation when circumstances forced choices between alternatives that all involved harm yet differed in magnitude or distribution of suffering they would produce. These debates assumed that evil existed along continuum rather than as binary opposition to good, that practical ethics often required selecting least harmful option from available alternatives rather than achieving outcomes that aligned fully with ideals about how situations should be resolved in worlds where justice and mercy operated without constraint. Bonhart's position relative to these debates proved illuminating precisely because his character seemed to offer no calculations about lesser evils, no framework where his actions could be understood as unfortunate necessities imposed by circumstances offering no better alternatives. He pursued cruelty as preference rather than as regrettable component of achieving objectives that might have justified means through reference to ends whose value exceeded costs imposed during their pursuit. His existence as counterpoint to Witcher's Code, the professional ethics that theoretically guided those who had undergone mutations and training to hunt monsters threatening human populations, revealed through contrast what happened when exceptional capabilities combined with complete absence of the restraints that codes attempted to impose on those possessing power disproportionate to normal human parameters. Witchers operated according to frameworks that emphasized neutrality in political conflicts, restriction of lethal force to situations where contracts justified intervention or self-defense demanded response, maintenance of professional conduct that distinguished them from simple mercenaries or freelance enforcers lacking organizational traditions and ethical inheritances. These codes existed partially as practical measures ensuring that communities tolerated witches' presence despite the fear and prejudice their mutations inspired, yet also reflected philosophical commitments about proper relationship between power and its exercise. Acknowledgement that capability to inflict harm created obligations to restrain that capability according to principles extending beyond immediate self-interest. Bonhart possessed capabilities approaching Witcher levels yet operated entirely outside any code, recognizing no obligations and maintaining no restraints beyond those imposed by tactical calculation about when violence served his purposes and when alternatives proved more advantageous to immediate objectives. The observation that Bonhart's characterization included no redemption arc, no complexity that might have humanized him through revelation of traumatic origins or competing loyalties that complicated moral assessment, distinguished him from many antagonists whose presentations included dimensions inviting sympathy or at minimum understanding about how they had arrived at positions opposing protagonists. Pure antagonism of the sort Bonhart embodied served specific narrative functions within saga whose overall moral architecture emphasized ambiguity and challenged readers' comfort with categorical judgments about characters and factions. His presence provided anchoring point at spectrum's extreme, reference against which other figures' moral status could be measured, demonstration that the saga's ethical complexity did not collapse into relativism where all positions enjoyed equal validity or where judgment became impossible because circumstances always sufficed to excuse choices individuals made. Some characters and actions remained condemnable across virtually any evaluative framework, establishing that moral ambiguity as saga's thematic concern did not eliminate possibility of moral clarity about certain individuals whose behavior placed them beyond territories where uncertainty about proper assessment might persist. What Bonhart's character revealed about Sapkowski's world-building extended beyond individual characterization into broader observations about the universe's moral physics, the principles governing how virtue and vice manifested and what consequences they generated for those who embodied them and those who encountered them. The continent as constructed throughout the saga featured no reliable cosmic justice ensuring that evil received punishment or that virtue achieved reward, moral outcomes emerging instead through interactions between characters' choices, their capabilities, and circumstances whose configurations reflected complex causation rather than divine or narrative intervention, guaranteeing that stories resolved according to ethical principles about deserved fates. Bonhart operated successfully across his career because his skills and methods proved effective within environment that imposed minimal constraints on predatory behavior when directed against victims lacking power to resist or allies capable of intervening. His eventual death came through confluence of factors including Ciri's determination and developing capabilities, circumstances that brought them together when her skills had improved sufficiently to prevail, rather than through inevitable cosmic correction, ensuring that someone of his moral status must face retribution regardless of practical considerations about capability distributions and tactical situations. The function of irredeemable evil in morally grey narratives concerned questions about whether stories whose thematic commitments emphasized complexity and ambiguity required figures representing extremes to provide contrast against which other characters' more ambiguous moral positions could be appreciated. Bonhart served this structural purpose within saga whose other antagonists frequently possessed justifications or motivations that complicated simple condemnation, where even deeply harmful actors like Vilgefortz pursued objectives that possessed internal logic and coherence even if methods proved monstrous. The presence of character whose evil appeared pure and whose actions resisted interpretation through frameworks that might have made them comprehensible if regrettable established that the saga's moral universe, while complex, maintained distinctions between those whose situations complicated judgment and those whose behavior transcended territories where circumstance or perspective might alter assessment. This preserved possibility of moral evaluation within narrative tradition that sometimes risked collapsing into relativism where nothing remained clearly wrong because every action could be contextualized through reference to pressures or incentives that made it understandable even when regrettable. Bonhart's role in Ciri's transformation from princess to survivor encompassed his function as catalyst for developments that her character underwent during captivity and subsequent resistance to his attempts at recapturing her after her escape. The abuse he inflicted and the systematic project of breaking her psychological integrity constituted trauma that shaped how she understood herself and the world, creating wounds that would never fully heal yet, which also generated knowledge and capabilities she might never have developed through gentler paths. Her survival of captivity, her victories in the arena despite drugging and abuse designed to reduce her to performing instrument, her eventual escape and tactical successes against pursuing forces, her ultimate triumph in their final duel, all demonstrated resilience that existed partially as response to the specific challenges he had imposed. The recognition that suffering under him prepared her for later trials created uncomfortable acknowledgement that trauma sometimes produced capabilities or psychological developments that proved necessary for survival in hostile environments. Observation that refused simple narrative about suffering serving no purpose or being purely destructive even as it avoided romanticizing abuse as beneficial or necessary for growth. How suffering under Bonhart prepared Ciri for later trials emerged through specific capabilities and psychological orientations that her experiences during captivity had developed or reinforced. Her tolerance for physical pain and ability to function effectively while injured or exhausted reflected conditioning that arena performances under adverse conditions had provided, creating familiarity with operating at extremes that might otherwise have paralyzed someone lacking such brutal preparation. Her understanding of human capacity for cruelty exceeded what sheltered upbringing would have taught, providing realistic assessment of threats she might face and appropriate caution about trusting others whose motivations remained ambiguous. The psychological resilience necessary to maintain identity coherence despite systematic attempts to reduce her to instrument demonstrated strength that perhaps required testing through actual assault on her sense of self rather than developing through theoretical instruction about maintaining integrity under pressure. These observations existed in tension with recognition that the costs imposed through Bonhart's abuse exceeded any benefits that might have emerged, that alternative paths toward developing resilience existed that would not have inflicted comparable trauma, that acknowledging how suffering shaped her growth did not constitute justification for that suffering or diminish his culpability for choosing to inflict it. The cost of survival, measured in psychological scars that never fully healed regardless of time elapsed or victories achieved after escaping from circumstances that had generated them, represented final accounting of Bonhart's impact that extended beyond his death into indefinite future where Ciri would carry marks of their encounters. The nightmares that might wake her decades hence, sudden triggers that brought unwanted memories flooding back through associations that rational thought could not prevent, difficulties with trust or intimacy stemming from violations of autonomy and dignity that captivity had imposed, all constituted ongoing costs that survival exacted even after immediate threats had ended. The recognition that she had survived and eventually prevailed offered satisfaction and vindication, yet could not erase experiences that had occurred or restore psychological innocence that systematic abuse had destroyed. Her continued existence represented triumph over someone who had attempted to reduce her to object serving his purposes. yet that triumph coexisted with permanent alterations to her consciousness and personality that Bonhart's actions had caused, creating legacy that would persist through whatever remained of her life, regardless of how far she traveled from the locations where their confrontations had occurred or how thoroughly she attempted to leave those experiences behind through time and distance. The closing meditation on memory, violence, and the stories told about both acknowledges that Bonhart's existence would be remembered through multiple narratives serving different purposes and reflecting varied relationships to events that had unfolded across territories where his pursuit of Ciri and others had left trails of trauma and corpses. For those who had survived encounters with him, memory carried personal weight that external accounts could never fully capture. Knowledge of what his presence felt like and how his particular form of cruelty manifested in moments that shaped their understanding of what humans could become when freed from constraints that normally limited expression of sadistic impulses. For those who knew his story only through reports and second-hand accounts, he existed as cautionary figure illustrating themes about power's corrupting potential or human capacity for evil. Abstraction whose significance derived from symbolic function rather than from lived experience of his actual impact. The stories told about Bonhart and those like him served purposes beyond simple historical record, functioning as warnings about what might be encountered in a world whose moral order provided no reliable protections against predatory individuals who combined exceptional capability with absence of ethical restraints, reminding each generation that vigilance remained necessary because the human capacity for becoming monstrous persisted across time and required resistance from those who would oppose such figures regardless of personal costs that opposition might demand when circumstances brought them face to face with evil that recognized no authority beyond its own preferences and maintained no purpose beyond satisfaction derived from wielding power over others in ways that maximized suffering and degradation of those unfortunate enough to fall within reach of someone who had cultivated cruelty as craft perfected across lifetime, dedicated to its systematic practice and refinement.